welcome to the first afternoon panel. The topic is the intersection between religion and conflict on the background of the topic of transnational and international relations. So both of those complexes were already topic in both of the two panels that we already had, but we'll now try to focus on those topics more explicitly. We have two excellent researchers on our panel. The third, Carlo Aldrovandi, had to drop out due to unforeseen personal circumstances, really understandable ones, and we wish him good luck for those issues. So we still have two remaining great panelists. Let me at first introduce Patrice. Patrice will have to leave after his presentation and the subsequent discussion, also due to obligations at university. Okay, so let me at first introduce you, Patrice. Patrice Brodeur is an associate professor in the Faculty of Theology and the Sciences of Religion at the University of Montreal. He's also senior advisor at the International Dialogue Center in Vienna, which still is in Vienna. In his research, Patrice focuses on the intersection of Islam, pluralism, and globalization. And in doing so, he deals with questions of integration, radicalization, and Islamophobia on the one hand, and based on that, on the other hand, theoretically and practically engages in interreligious and intercultural dialogue. I hope that was more or less appropriate. And with that, Patrice, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Vielen Dank, Dr. Laktisch. It's really nice to be joining you online, all of you, and my apologies for both not being able to be there earlier today or tomorrow morning. I teach also tomorrow morning, but after this presentation, one of my doctoral students is defending her thesis, so and there was no other choice but to put it at that time. And thanks for the organizers, Dr. Lucas and also Dr. Vinta, for adjusting the timetable to make room for me to be able to at least present my paper at the moment now. So again, my apologies. So let me begin immediately by saying that, of course, you've all seen my title, which is the Contemporary Transnational Geopolitics of Interreligious Dialogue. There are many ways of approaching this topic, and especially if one thinks about this more general topic of religion, conflict, and transnational relations, I think that it fits the bill, but not so much from the perspective of conflict that as such, but rather from the perspective of reacting often to conflict and proposing a different approach, a more constructive, open sort of relational approach to addressing conflicts and issues through dialogue. So having said this preamble, let me begin by saying that in this paper, I argue that the exponential increase in interreligious dialogue worldwide, with myriad kinds of activities from the local to the global, is in the process of changing, in my opinion, contemporary transnational geopolitics, especially in the area that we call soft power in international relations. Indeed, these changes require an expansion of the notion of continuous power, that is, a continuum from harder forms of power to softer ones, according to Rothman, 2011. And this should be done in such a way that it would allow for better integration into softer kinds of powers, and thereby new forms of diplomacy. Of what exactly? Well, of the unique multi- and inter-organizational dynamics of interreligious dialogue, whether municipal, national, international, or global, whether also through older institutions, or newer FBOs, faith-based organizations, NGOs, international NGOs, or intergovernmental organizations. These changes are creating new forms of diplomacy and thereby transforming international relations towards trans-sectorial relations. So much more than the general focus of realist approach to politics, looking at interstate dynamics. So therefore, this contribution of interreligious dialogue, in my opinion, helps to redefine possibly the notion of power dynamics between traditional nation states and multinationals on the one hand, to include a broader set of increasingly influential players, both older institutional religious networks and newer transnational civil society actors, including social media influencers. In order to prove this point, I'm going to do three things. not all of which that's going to be in the paper, not all of which I have time to talk about today. But the first one is to summarize what I mean by an exponential increase in interreligious dialogue, giving just a few organizational examples, as well as examples of kinds of products of dialogue, a kind of typology. Then I will do, in the paper, provide a brief description of the changing nature of multilateral diplomacy and international relations in light of increased collaboration between a variety of traditional seats of governance power and a broad diversity of religious actors, both institutional and organizational. That's the part which I will skip. Finally, in the third part, I will situate the contemporary transnational geopolitics of interreligious dialogue in a conceptual framework of continuous power, explaining both how this framework can enhance our understanding of this kind of dialogue, and reciprocally, how such dialogue practices can in turn enrich the concept of soft power, thereby potentially expanding theories of international relations to reflect a new post-secular world order facing actually also at the same time a potential extinction according to Colbert 2014. So let me begin now with the first part, which is to summarize what I mean by exponential increase in interreligious dialogue. In previous publications, I've touched upon that, and I have described in more detail than I can do here the exponential increase globally throughout the first 2 decades of the 21st century in particular. This increase is both the result of and one among several reasons for the need to expand the notion of soft power in international relations from the theoretical perspective of critical geopolitics of religion. So let me share my screen now just to give you a sense of what I mean by exponential growth, because it's going to be easier to follow the screen than to actually hear me simply list and chronologically a list of dates of foundations of different organizations. So give me 2 seconds now, and I will do just that. There we go. So now I think everybody sees sort of that list that I'm talking about. Yes, Max? Good, okay. In general, if one looks at the overview of the history of the modern interreligious dialogue movement, which most scholars basically agree it starts in 1893 with the World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago, one can actually locate 4 major international events, followed by the growth of the launch of the founding of organizations, of interreligious dialogue organizations, sometimes also called interfaith. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'll keep to the word interreligious. And I'm listing here about 30 of these different international organizations that have emerged over the years, almost all of which still exist to this day. So what you have, though, is, and you can see the exponential dimension, is that in the first sort of 60, 70 years or so, you have actually very few things happening. First, the actual first event of the Parliament of Religion in Chicago. Then there's the founding of what is still today the oldest of these organizations, called the IARF, International Association for Religious Freedom, based, initially founded in Boston, a bit of as an offshoot of the Parliament, in fact. But that's a different story. It was renamed under its current name in 1969. And then there was a short-lived, but nevertheless important, Religiöser Menschheitsbund that was founded in Germany. And finally, sort of a major event, Religions of Empire Conference in London, with a follow-up eventually, although it took a while, organizations called World Congress of Faith that is still in existence today. And finally, there was shortly after the First World War, the International Council of Christians and Jews, based today in Heppenheim in Germany. And that organization had national precedence in 1928 in the US, an American National Conference of Christians and Jews had actually been founded. But the important is to see that there's a slow picking up at the beginning in the first 70 years or so. But then comes the 1960s. To really see the emergence of these organizations as a reflection really of the development of civil society in a variety of Western countries initially, and then of course much broader internationally. And there, I am not going to go through all of this list, but just you can see the exponential growth here through the years on the left, chronologically put of the founding of those organizations. And I think it's important to notice that initially, most of them are founded in Western North Atlantic countries. And eventually, much later on, from the late 80s onwards, you begin to have sort of a broader set of foundations taking place from India to Indonesia to Jordan and so on and so forth, as you can see from the list. Now, it's really in the last 20 years that you begin to see an interesting development taking place in that exponential growth. And it is no longer only individuals coming together to found sort of in NGOs, interreligious dialogue organization as NGOs, but you begin to see that the implication of nation states, in particular in Muslim majority nation states, using basically the development of these organizations as a kind of soft power for both internal and external purposes. And that's where you find sort of most of them in the list that you see here, including, of course, the CAICID International Dialogue Center based in Vienna for the next month, but soon to move to Portugal next month. So that's for the list. I said I would not sort of go further into details because otherwise it will take too much time, but it is the empirical sort of basis for what I'm talking about when I say an exponential growth. And that, of course, is only the tip of the iceberg by looking at it through the eyes of organizations, not looking at it through the guise of or through the other means of people coming together in informal ways to dialogue in different ways. Then if I move now briefly to a typology of products of dialogue, I would say that there is here sort of a variety of different options. I've listed 6 of them here. There is the dialogic events per se, and of course they address all kinds of topics, often sort of addressing, of course, current needs and social concerns, whether local or global. There are courses and trainings, whether in the traditional in-person or now more recently new online formats with many accompanying publications from books to manuals, etc. The third sort of kind is the reports and documentations in both traditional paper and newer media formats, video clips, recordings, web pages, so on and so forth. The fourth is formal interreligious declarations, and that's the one which I will focus on for my third section of this paper. Formal interreligious declarations of all kinds, and on most issues of current concerns by one segment or another of the human population worldwide. 5, you have policy-related papers with a variety of recommendations addressed to different levels of governance, from the municipal to the global levels, including the UN and the G20, for example. That's one particular angle that CAICID is involved in and that I have more direct practical experience of, although I have experience personally with all of the previous categories of productions. And finally, the 6th one, and more recently, new reports and academic articles and books on how to monitor and evaluate interreligious dialogue in order to, at least so the theory goes, to better measure its impact. And here there's a recent publication by Professor Abu Nimr and Renata Smith, especially in line with UN and the whole development of the SDGs, with which many interreligious dialogue efforts are trying to align themselves with. These different kinds of products of dialogue, taken all together, have indeed had a direct impact on the changing nature of multilateral diplomacy in the last 20 years or so, as we shall now turn to well, eventually in the paper in the second part. So let me then sort of go back and say that I'm going to move immediately to the third part, which is to situate the contemporary transnational geopolitics of interreligious dialogue in a conceptual framework of continuous power from, as I said earlier, hard power to soft power, but not in a dichotomous way in which it had first been developed by the American political scientist and theorist of international relations, Joseph Nye, especially in 1990, but which he then redefined soft power in 2004 as, and I quote, the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payments. It arises from the attractiveness of a country's culture, political ideals, and policies. When our policies are seen as legitimate in the eyes of others, our soft power is enhanced, unquote. Rothman, in his paper of 2011, quotes this definition at the beginning of his article entitled, quote, "Revisiting the soft power concept. What are the means and mechanisms of soft power?" Question mark, unquote. It was published in the Journal of Political Power. In this article, he proposes, and I would argue rightly so, to move away from a dichotomous understanding of soft versus hard power, suggesting instead to use a continuous spectrum from harder forms of power to softer ones. In this latter end of the spectrum, he, quote, redefined the power of attraction as a form of soft power and equated the different norms of power with resources for implementing such power in international politics, unquote. Now, Rothman still argues, mostly implicitly in his article, within the framework of nation state as the source of power, whether harder or softer in forms. In this respect, despite what I argue is a temporary consolidation today of the still dominant nation state framework in international relations, given, of course, the current reactions to health security issues worldwide due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are nevertheless witnessing a rapid transformation of this framework in the face of growing pressures and threats emerging from the internet and social media, among other places, fueling not only the negative side, for example, fake news, extremist discourses, and transporter interference, whether in democratic processes or through cybersecurity threats and vulnerabilities. But this new virtual space represents a new and ever more present invisible fourth dimension, I call it, added to our traditional three-dimensional daily reality as human beings on Earth. It is quickly transforming the balance of power between governments, businesses, and civil society, affecting all three in turn, as well as their complex global interconnections transnationally. Religious actors of all kinds, for better or for worse, have quickly jumped in this virtual space, of course, greatly speeding up the transition from a dominant secular international community to now a post-secular transnational global humanity marred with a complex variety of inter- and codependencies. One example of what seems to me to fall in the category of the better, without falling though into being accused of being naive, is precisely the exponential growth in interreligious dialogue worldwide, as described previously, in the form of a rapid growth in its numerous organizations and products, with the resulting outcome, of course, on diplomacy. So now in this third section, within the limited space given to me and time allotted, I will embark on the main aim of this paper, which is to argue how the development of this particular kind of IRD product, i.e. the IRD or the Interreligious Dialogue Declarations, how they are changing the discourse of values in international relations on a number of topics, from the urgency of opposing the hijacking of religions by extremist radical and at times terrorist rhetorics of so-called religious legitimacy, to the growing multi-religious consensus to boldly address, for example, the need for urgent policy, production, and consumption changes to avert the worst in climate change threats to our common humanity on Earth, not to mention all kinds of other examples of growing intolerance of identity dynamics fueled by fears due to myopic outlooks on perceived competing interest in a zero-sum game over control of resources rooted too often in narrow ethno or ethno-religious nationalistic discourses. So, in this article, Rothman describes in his article, what he does is he describes four categories of ideal types within the continuum of power types, as well as the behavior and resources associated with each type of power. He does so because he argues that, quote, this provides a basis from which future scholars can examine the effects of power in international relations outcomes. So, well, I am therefore one such future scholars 10 years later who tries to examine the effects of interreligious dialogue declarations, in particular on the changing nature of diplomacy within soft powers, within the soft powers end in international relations. So what are these four categories that he talks about? First, command and military resources. I shall not go in this direction. The second one is economic forms of power, and I will not touch on that either. The third one is the one that is more directly related to this paper, is agenda setting and institutional control. And finally, the fourth one, which is directly related to these declarations, is framing, and rhetoric. This fourth category is the one that Rothman considers to be at the rightmost side of the continuum of power dynamics in international relations. Indeed, if we take the case of interreligious dialogue declarations, they definitely fall under this fourth, quote, framing and rhetoric category. Now, Rothberg in his paper also subdivides further this category into two subdivisions: normative framing and analytical framing. Under normative framing, he points to the important role that moral framing can play in changing perceptions about reality and what to do about it. Now, moral framing is obviously something directly related to religion, religion often sort of being well known for providing moral frameworks about reality. Indeed, interreligious declarations play precisely this role, both within their participating religious institutions and beyond them, in the private sphere of individual religious actors, but also in the public sphere of collective organizational religious actors, including how within their participating religious institutions and beyond, my apologies, including how the latter relate to the political spheres relevant to their local context. Under the second category, that is analytical framing, Rothman includes both victim states, so perceived, and perpetrating states, as well as, unquote, other actors in the international system. Obviously, because he limits mostly his analysis to nation states, this is where I come in with the IRD dialogue as another angle of these other actors in the international system. So it is clear that the impetus for the launch of several of the newer interreligious dialogue national and international organizations by efforts, yes, indeed, often of nation states, is a way to shape the analytic framing or present a particular narrative framework to shape the agenda setting in international relations. For example, in the case of many of the organizations that I've listed in the latter part in the last 20 years, you see this definitely being done by majority Muslim nation states, who therefore sort of use the agenda setting counter to civilizational clashes of Huntington as an argument to say, no, Islamists are there to promote dialogue and so on and so forth. So there's very much of an effort to counter this agenda setting of the international community. This has been the case already, decades ago already, with the emergence of the World Council of Churches first, and then with the paradigm shift associated in particular with the encyclical Nostra Aetate, when the Holy See back in the early 1960s, shifted when the Holy See, faced with the new reality of loss of direct political power, had to rethink its role in international relations, resulting in a major paradigm shift from a solely exclusivist truth claim to an openness to dialogue with a variety of others, both internal to the diverse family of Christianities and beyond it, as well both religiously and ideologically at a time when the international community was still in the throes of the Cold War. At the turn of the 21st century, after 9/11 in particular, a similar paradigm shift has been taking place over the last 20 years within the diverse family of Islams and beyond it. I have published an article precisely on that in Islamo-Christiana, and I will just sort of read one paragraph of that article because it summarizes sort of that specific look at Islamic declarations of interreligious dialogue, either done by multi-religious organizations or done by Islamically based organizations, but in a framework of interreligious dialogue. And I quote from that paper published last year in Islamo-Christiana number 46, the following, quote, "Through an interdisciplinary analysis that combines mostly sociology, religious studies, and geopolitics, this last section of that paper aims to shed more light on the collective importance of Islamic declarations of interreligious dialogue in particular, as they demonstrate a historical paradigm shift in three concurrent ways. First, within the landscape of contemporary Islamic thought. Second, in relation to other religious traditions, especially Abrahamic, but also at times Dharmic, and very little of the others. And thirdly, within the global context of the so-called international community of nation states, so ideologically shaped by its emergence in a post-World War II context with an initially Western secular age." Now, so In conclusion, what I would like to say is that the examination in the overall paper at the end of how interreligious dialogue declarations are changing multilateral diplomacy internationally is one reason to argue why the contemporary transnational geopolitics of this dialogue now requires an expansion of the critical geopolitics theory of international relations to accommodate the complex role of religious actors globally, thereby directly contributing, in my opinion, to a new post-secular world order facing not only a potential sixth extension because of the climate change challenges, while also, interestingly, directly addressing through a new common moral framing the need to urgently collaborate interreligiously and beyond with policymakers at all levels of governance in order to face altogether this latest threat to our collective and interdependent human survival, a threat which, in conclusion, the magnitude of which is much greater than either the rise of different forms of extremism and terrorism in the last few decades or that of our current global COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrice, for this really fascinating and intriguing tour de force to the foundations of international relations, accommodating to current or decades-old already developments within religion and international organizations. Let me ask a first question also to clarify something that I'm not sure of how you are seeing it or how you interpret it. Is religion also a driving force of a certain dynamics of transnationalization, or is the transnationalization of religion a symptom or a manifestation of other dynamics?
It's both.
Okay.
In a nutshell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we already have one question in the chat from Christoph Rode from Munich, who says that he represents Christian realism a la Niebuhr. He asked for an evaluation about the role of the World Council of Churches for peace processes. And he also refers to important members of it, like John Foster Dulles, and in its support for the United Nations.
Well, here, first, let me say that I am not as much of an expert on the World Council of Churches as I am on contemporary Islamic thought and its development in the realm of participation of Muslims in interreligious dialogue of different kinds. So that's one thing. But from my understanding, the World Council of Churches, of course, is different in the nature. First of all, it's already in and of itself a gathering of mostly transnational religious institutions, often very old, pre-modern ones, in a network that is truly sort of part of the dynamic of a creative civil society approach that both sort of functions at at all those levels of 7 levels of governance, from very local, municipal, to all the way to global dynamics within the UN and other in other contexts today with the social media internet sphere. So the World Council of Churches, in my opinion, precisely because at least initially did not include the Roman Catholic Church, had a very sort of, had a certain distance from the traditional international relations of nation states. And its relationship to the United Nations as such took a while to develop before it eventually sort of through its national churches, in some cases, was able to sort of bring into a perspective and play more of a role within the UN. But still, to this day, I would argue that it doesn't play a direct role in the way that other religious organizations do, especially, of course, for obvious sort of reasons of the city-state nature given to the Holy See in international politics that the Catholic Church plays. And that's, of course, a privilege that only it has and no other religious institutions have on the international scene. That's obvious. But therefore, the World Council of Churches in these dynamics, I think, sort of is more a player from that it has, of course, promoted dialogue in the first place. In fact, it was the first player that promoted transnational interreligious dialogue, both Jewish Christian and Christian Muslim initially, and then much broader, as well as multi-religious later on. In ways that I think has actually sort of addressed sort of the more traditional understandings of theologies addressing particular themes, and improving sort of the quality of mutual understanding between the participants about these themes and their approaches and whatnot. And it's only much more recently that the World Council of Churches has positioned itself, especially on the question of the environment, already from a few decades ago, in the business of actually sort of putting pressure on governments and the international community in changing policies in this respect. So that's the primary role, I would say, that the World Council of Churches has played at that level of international relations. But I definitely would love to hear more from your perspective on that, and add to my learning on that front as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Franz, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm referring now to this list which you were presenting in the presentation, which is actually proof for the increase of this dialogue situations to a certain kind. I mean, the first thing, what is a kind of challenge, of course, to the idea that since the 60s there was a growing, this kind of scenery was growing. I mean, there would be a very simple explanation. It is easy to organize international organizations and international meetings to a certain extent since the 60s because of different possibilities. I mean, it was very difficult, for example, to organize 1893 something like a World Conference of Religions, and nowadays it's quite easy, and since the 60s, so it's a kind of self-explaining to a certain extent, which is my first question. And the second question, I mean, this is not a real argument, just a comment, but the second question is referring to this particular last portion of this new sector when it comes to this interreligious dialogues, which is interreligious centers and dialogues in the Islamic world. And you were referring to several organizations there in various countries. And I mean, there are many critics of this kind of development who are kind of presenting an argument which is, I mean, very critical of this development insofar as they say that this is often used as a kind of cover-up, which is a kind of something which is presented to the fore, while the situation in the various countries, when it comes to the situation of religions, when it comes to interreligious dialogue in the various countries where we have these big centers, did not change at all, and sometimes is devastatingly problematic to a certain extent. What do you say to this argument?
Yes, of course, we all know about the fig leaf concept that was used, and still is used to accuse Kaisit, for example, but other organizations coming from more centralized government, not to say authoritarian, depending on each cases, that actually will address that is used in order to say that, that they're doing this in order to improve their image internationally and so on and so forth. I would not have been spending so much time working at Kaisit as a scholar if I had not thought of it in a different way, in fact, because I started to realize that both for the historical reasons of the King Abdullah's vision of how to go about transforming his own societies post 9/11, given sort of the appropriate critique of the international community in the role of Saudi Arabia and several of its components to the promotion of a Puritan kind of Islam that has led and fueled Islamism in ways that sometimes have actually directly contributed, of course, through some of its citizens to terrorism, to say the least. That dimension is something that is definitely there. But the reason why the king eventually sort of established first a national center of dialogue, and then only afterwards, a few years later, developed an international center for the promotion of interreligious dialogue in a way that was actually, interestingly enough and creatively, more than only Abrahamic, which already was pushing the envelope from a Puritan Wahhabi Saudi perspective, was actually sort of in order to be able to I think, although never saying so directly, do what I would call sort of a boomerang effect on Saudi society. That's my own theory after having sort of worked at CAICID 3 years full-time and since then part-time in that context. Is that, and what do I mean by boomerang effect? And that I think applies also possibly to other of these countries that have developed their own centers, from Kazakhstan to Bahrain to the UAE and so on and so forth. And what they have done, in fact, in this boomerang is that we were able to invite in Vienna and in other places outside of Saudi Arabia a number of the top religious leaders of the Saudi Shura Council, for example, and get them involved into signing international declarations that include sort of the legitimizing of the Yazidis, for example, in light of what happened to them, sadly, under the Daesh pressures of genocide, to put it bluntly. And in that context, it was very clear that this was a historical first for a Wahhabi person to sign an international declaration recognizing the right for Wahhabis to exist was already changing, the nature of, Wahhabi understanding of its relationship to a non-Islamic sort of, although small, religious community that normally would be completely outside the realm of acceptability, i.e. kafir, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously, in that way, that's one very, very tangible example, but there are many other examples whereby surely some of the top religious leaders of the country are not able internally to meet leaders of other religions because they're often not invited or not allowed even to come in. But of course, when they're meeting them in another context, slowly but surely in a dialogical process that has potential, at least potentially, some transformative impact, which then is brought back home, that's the boomerang effect, in ways that then sort of opens them up in ways to transforming internal, their own understanding and what's possible for Saudi Arabia as one example. So I've been contributing and being a firm believer that that's really important as a means of transforming societies. And it's one that also respects internal dynamics and is not something that comes from outside, being imposed from outside in imperialist sort of ways or paternalistic ways. So that I think is important to understand. But of course, the case for each of the countries that have developed a national center or international one is going to be slightly different, but all of them actually relates to this notion of soft power. And that's why I'm trying to theorize sort of how this is changing the norm, because normally if you look at Joseph Nieh's understanding and definition, the later definition of 2004 of soft power, it's as if, you attract other countries to do like you, in part because they like what you do. But in this case, you have, many countries are not necessarily in line with the official policy or their understanding and perception of official policy of these countries, whether it's the nature of their political regimes or some of the activities that have taken place under those auspices, in ways that therefore are not attractive at all. And yet, you have paradoxically, some of the centers that are doing really cutting edge and really important development when it comes to dialogue and addressing a variety of social problems internationally. And so, and one of those major paradigm shift is because of the extremeness of Daesh, of ISIS, mainline religious communities worldwide have had to position themselves in much more explicit ways than ever before in history to reject sort of the misuse of Islamic discourses for the promotion of such extremist behaviors. And that's a paradigm shift historically in Islamic thought. And so that's in part the results of these kinds of dialogical sort of efforts that are taking place in this soft power approach that some of these organizations are playing, including CAICID.
Thank you. Joseph, please.
Yeah, this is almost a follow-up question with regard to your very general point of the ERD declarations. Basically, you say that, or you proved the exponential increase of interreligious dialogue activities over the last 130 years or so. But at the same time, you highlight that these IRD declarations have much more to do with agenda setting, institutional control, and framing and rhetoric. And this brings me to the question, what is interreligious dialogue all about in the end? in terms of soft power. Isn't it this the traditional formula of soft power, that this is nothing else but an additional instrument of contestation, of driving conflict, not looking for peace, but driving conflict by driving contestation. Yeah, if the overall purpose is simply framing and agenda setting. Yeah. So what is the effectivity of interreligious dialogue altogether in the end, in your assessment?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, we need to distinguish between those organizations that have, are part of national agendas in terms of participation in international relations, and they are definitely, using those organizations as part of, national agenda setting internationally. So that's definitely the case. But there are a lot of other international dialogue organizations that are more IGOs or INGOs than they are, governmental or intergovernmental, and those organizations are not in that sort of agenda setting from the perspective of soft powers in traditional understanding of international relations from a nation state perspective. And so, for example, Religions for Peace International, which is the largest of the international interreligious dialogue organizations that have more than 50 years now, is definitely not the case of agenda setting from a nation state perspective at all. But it is about agenda setting when it comes to influencing the UN and its frameworks and its activities in order to transform societies, within sort of these multiple layers from the local to the global. And so what I'm saying is that because of this diversity of approaches that one can see through the ways in which these international dialogue declarations are both produced and what they aim to do, both of those lead me to say that we need to expand and complexify the notion of soft power, and not leave it to what you've just mentioned, which of course is the traditional way of understanding soft power. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Marco.
Allow me to ask another question. You kind of implicated this demand for international relations theory to accommodate to these changes and to integrate religion as a soft power. For which kind of international relations paradigm would you go for? You already mentioned Joseph Nye, so I assume it might be neoliberalism, neorealism.
No, in fact, no, I mentioned him simply because he was at the initial sort of, framing of conceptually of notions of soft power. No, I'm in a way, I'm more interested in critical geopolitics of religion, sort of, wanting to try to address sort of the dynamics of how these both religious institutions, many of which are, of course, transnational today, or historically as well, for that matter, as well as the particular interreligious dialogue organizations that are, part of INGOs, for the most part, with the exception of CAICID, which is an intergovernmental organization, as well as, of course, the branch of the United Nations called the Alliance of Civilization, which is part of an IGO framework. Except for those two, most of the international organizations that are promoting interreligious dialogue, they are part of shaping geopolitics, in part because their relationship to political power is actually going to be done, and this is where it gets really complicated, and I'm still trying to figure out sort of how to make sense of that complexity, because as we all know, religion is a complex matter, and religious institutions are incredibly diverse, both internally to each of the religious traditions, as well as transsectorial, in a transversal way, and that complexity means that the relationship to politics will vary a lot depending on which country one is in. For example, if one actually thinks about sort of the history in each country of the world of how the current politics of that country relates to the world of religion in that country, you have a huge spectrum of diversity that takes place. And so part of the ways in which dialogue takes place is in part rooted in those national realities that are so diverse when you compare them from even within Western Europe, from England to France, let alone, if you expand, go a little further east to Poland, or, if you'd go from, Italy to Sweden and so on, just the European sort of sheer diversity of situations, nationally speaking, when you compare them, is enough to sort of make us, wait and, to look back and say, okay, how do we make sense of this conceptually, critically, using critical geopolitics of religions, and then seeing how that complexity also applies even within the Gulf state countries. You have a diversity of approaches to those issues, and so there we go. I'm going to stop here, but it definitely is a rich field to do further research around.
Okay, thank you. Very fascinating. So I see no other questions in the chat and no raised hands anymore. So I'll say it again. Thank you, Patrice, for coming and for contributing to our project and initiative.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Professor Winter in particular, and I'll try to join you in the latter part tomorrow. Take care.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, so now let's come to our second presentation. It is an honor to introduce to you Michael Antonov. Michael is professor at the Institute of State Theory, Legal Theory, and History of Law at the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg in Russia. He's also currently a visiting research fellow at the Law Faculty in Graz, and as such, a colleague of mine also. We're really happy to have him here. In his research, Michael focuses on problems of normativity in law and sociological jurisprudence, the theory of sovereignty and human rights. And in his research, religion, among others, plays a role as an element of sovereignty, if I understood correctly, but he'll tell us more about it shortly. So, Michael, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maximilian. Do you see me? Because I don't know why the video is not working on my.
It's working.
Do you see me?
Yes.
Yes, now,
yes,
now it's okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to this very important event, to this conference. Well, initially in my presentation, I intended to characterize how the Russian state utilizes the conservative ideology to undermine the binding force of human rights. It is exactly the title of my contribution to the first Schrift of Professor Marco. Wait, I decided to take only one of the facets of this large theme, and this is about how the teaching of the Russian Orthodox Church on human dignity is instrumentalized to underplay the significance of human rights, and how the state and church cooperate in defining the meanings of human dignity in the public sphere. As a matter of fact, this redefinition is a part of the larger strategy of the political power to reinterpret the liberal Russian constitution in illiberal terms. And it's interesting to see how the church assists the Russian state in doing so. So now I will try to upload my presentation. Yes. Yes, it must be working. Thank you so much, Max. I'm sorry. So please, can I click this presentation? Or Professor Marco, could you please click the second page? So, as you see, the definition of human dignity in the Russian Constitution, initially, it was really a liberal principle in the views of the founding fathers of the Russian Constitution. Human dignity was intended to wind the foundation of other human rights, and the idea of human dignity, this formulation of human dignity, the Russian constitution, was inspired by the Kantian principles and also by the German constitutional doctrine of Menschenwürde. One finds this reading of human dignity in one of the rulings of the Russian Constitutional Court. You see a citation of it: "A person shall never be an object for the state." But over the time, this concept acquired in the public sphere illiberal connotations, and now it is quite far away from how Kant understood it. To illustrate the change of the mindset, I mean, the more and more illiberal conservative mindset, I provided several citations. Could you, Professor Marco, please click on the next page? Yes. You see several citations from Vladimir Kruz, his leading authority in Russian Constitutional Court. Nikolai Bonder and Valery Zorkin are constitutional judges. And you see also Vladimir Putin. Well, I will not read. You can read yourself to have an idea about how human rights are conceived in our public discourse. In the practice of the Russian Constitutional Court, the concept of human dignity served in two ways. First, as a tool to endorse the supreme value of social and economic rights over classical human rights. In this sense, the Constitutional Court continued the Soviet logic, which insisted on priority of social economic rights over political rights and individual freedoms. I wanted to cite two cases: the famous Yukos case. It's not on the side. The Yukos case. One of the reasons to justify the Khodorkovsky trial and the following expropriation of Yukos for the Russian courts and also for the Russian Constitutional Court was the argument about social importance of distribution of the funds acquired through expropriation to better protect human dignity. The court mentioned the necessity to secure human dignity of those who receive pensions and other subsidies from the state. And this argument was also on the table when the court refused to enforce in Russia the ECCHR judgment in the case of Yukos shareholders. The court reasoned that paying to these shareholders around 50 billions of euro would undermine state's capacity to pay pensions and so on. And with this would create a threat to human dignity of all the receivers of state subventions, such as pensioners. In the practice of the Constitutional Court, this reference to human dignity worked not only as a legal remedy, but on the contrary, as a limitation of rights and freedom. And this second use can be illustrated by a series of cases about gay parades, banning gay parades, LGBT communities in Russia. The court argued that dignity of particular individuals cannot overweigh the dignity of the majority of the population. Well, we see it turns out to be a very well-known conservative argument. As a matter of fact, the concept of human dignity is associated with the traditional values, which are often portrayed in the public sphere as illiberal ones. This concept was instrumentalized as an antidote to liberal interpretation of human rights. And the main argument here is that human rights depend on where the owner of these rights maintains his human dignity or not. And if the owner of human rights uses his or her rights to pervert his or her dignity or threaten to the dignity of others, then protection of his rights can be waived. It was the main argument in the gay parade cases for the Constitutional Court. And the historical tradition and social is the main reference framework for definition of what human dignity is. My thesis is that Russian Orthodox Church has significantly contributed to this change of meanings of human dignity, of the concept of human dignity in the public discourse, in the public sphere, and also in the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court. In the 2000 fundamentals of the social or doctrine of the Orthodox Church, the document has already been mentioned by Professor Stöckl. The Church utilized the concept of dignity to argue against propaganda of homosexuality and transsexuality, and against other sinful uses of human rights. Also, the Church applied human dignity to emphasize the traditional values in such matters as, for example, the difference of sexes, the roles attributed to sexes in family life and in other social fields. As you know, this term of propaganda of homosexuality found later on its expression also in the Russian legislation. The continuation of this doctrine in the basic teaching on human rights, human dignity, freedoms, and rights is more radical. This teaching insists that human rights can be accepted only to the extent they are in conformity with the religious dogma. This plainly contradicts the Russian constitution. I will not read these two citations. There could be more citation, but well, this opposition can be summarized in the words of the teaching. Once human rights, and I have underlined it, once human rights cannot be set against the values and interests of one's homeland, community, and family. And you see, this is plainly conservative interpretation. And human dignity is one of the key elements of this opposition between religious dogma and constitutional law. But what human dignity is as such, in the 2006 Declaration on Human Rights and Dignity, adopted by the World Russian People's Council, Всемирный Русский Собор, under the guidance of the Russian Orthodox Church, it was explained that human dignity is not inborn, it is acquired only by doing good. It means that dignity is not a natural human inborn right, but just a result of a positive evaluation of a person by the community in which he or she lives. And could you please next slide, Professor Marka? Now, within the time I have, I will come to several conclusions. Such floating signifiers at human dignity, but it's not the only one. In the Russian public sphere, we have such floating signifiers as sovereignty or traditional values and many others. Such signifiers are utilized in official narratives, firstly to educate the citizens about real limits of their human rights, and secondly to conceal ideological inconsistencies. For example, when constitutional interpretation contradicts the letter and the spirit of the Constitution, or one can use in cases of such contradiction, to use the Hegelian dialectical language to overcome this contradiction in a synthesis frame in the form of one of the mystical and
yeah.
But I'm afraid that my time is running already out.
No, we have some 15 minutes left for discussion and debate.
Okay. Can you please? Okay. I'm sorry. Could you please tell me on which moment I have disappeared?
You stopped at the very end of your conclusions.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Now.
Can you just repeat? Yeah. Can you just summarize your conclusions? Yes. Yeah. So that we have a starting point again for the debate and the discussion.
Okay, I will do it in the following manner. Well, as Professor Stöckl has brilliantly outlined today, the strategy of the Russian Orthodox Church in the global cultural wars is to somehow to resist, to fight the cosmopolitanism in many aspects. And in my opinion, and sure it's not only my opinion, one of the directions in which the Russian Orthodox Church is doing it is interpretation of human rights. In this respect, the strategy of the Church goes in line with that of the Russian state. The state also seeks to resist so-called sinful effects of globalization. And as you know, and following this agenda, Russia is actually also recruiting some allies from the similarly minded conservative movements in Europe. This strategy is supported by the Russian Orthodox Church, and this comes as not a wonder, it's not surprisingly. On the one hand, it can be explained by the so-called past dependence, I mean the historical tradition of cooperation between the church and the state, which has always existed and is just continuing now. And on the other hand, unfortunately, by the opportunistic interests pursued by the church, or rather by the church hierarchs. I mean that for assisting the state in its political game, the church gets not only economic preferences, but also is assisted by the state in, let's call it purging heresies, or in the modern language, about pushing out the non-traditional religious denominations, Jehovah's Witnesses, as we have mentioned today. But I'm afraid to conclude that that this strategy of the church can be erroneous. To follow the terminology of Scott Appleby, in the ambivalence of the sacred, the Russian church follows the bad side of this ambivalence, I mean the militant strategy, and not that of peace building. The church helps the state, assist the state propaganda in dividing the society into friends and enemies, into the majority and minorities, and seeks to assert itself as a kind of moral entrepreneur, speaking on behalf of the majority. And the church uses this role to stigmatize, to purge its opponent, such as religious and other minorities, and is doing it with the help of the state. And probably with doing this, the church makes the wrong choice. We evaluate this choice in terms of the principles of Christianity. So I will stop here. I hope more or less you have caught what I wanted to say, but sure, not sure. So thank you so much for your attention, and excuse me for all this mess.
Thank you, Michael. Not a problem. So the problem was not 200% on your side, because you used the web browser version of Zoom, and the bandwidth is really poor of the browser version. So you now have a. I
tried to, yes. Excuse me for.
No problem. So thanks for the presentation. I think you introduced us really well to the main points of your presentation. If I may start with the first question that also tries to relate to the topic of transnationalism. So in your presentation, you outlined the crucial role for the Russian Orthodox Church for the sovereignty or maintaining sovereignty of the regime, which is significant from a national point of view. But do you also see a certain transnational appeal of the Russian Church in its role as the third Rome, probably after the fall of Constantinople, that it tries to play with a little bit and also to affirm the sovereignty?
Yes, one can say so, that the concept of sovereignty is, as a matter of fact, one of the key of the key political concepts in the Russian intellectual history. And I have already made a presentation on this point. Sovereignty means that it must be one unified state, which is supported by the church, and they more or less work in an alliance, in a union. So in the terms of the religious doctrine, it's called a symphony of powers. And doing this, probably the state gets certain ideological advantages, and also probably the church is trying to do the same, either following its own strategy, its own policies, or just assisting the state in its ideological objectives. So more or less I can comment on this. So.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, Joseph.
Yeah. May I add another question? Since you have mentioned the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court, Mr. Zorkin, do you think that the Constitutional Court is also following basically the declarations of the Russian Orthodox Church word by word, or is this some sort of a triangular relationship between the church, the Constitutional Court, and the President of State? Because in socialist times we were used to say this is telephone justice made, and now Zorkin does not call the metropolitan in Moscow how to decide cases, or does he?
Yes, as a matter of fact, you are completely right. The Constitutional Court cannot cite, and it has never done so, cannot cite the doctrine, teaching, or other documents of the Russian Orthodox Church, because still we have on our constitution the principle of secularity and the principle of separation of the state and church. But as a matter of fact, the court, and one can trace it in the writings and the public speeches of the justices and of the Chief Justice Zorkin, that when they comment, when they interpret such a difficult concept, open concepts such as human dignity, for example, they repeat more or less. They are repeating what is written in these programmatic church documents. Surely I cannot say that Zorkin has caught up patriarch and asked what to do. But in my opinion, it works another way. We have well, this public sphere, and public sphere is controlled more or less by two major players, the state and the church. The state is the main player, and the church is the second, which assists the state in its ideological agenda. And because of this, in the public sphere, we have all these meanings of such big grand narratives about, for example, sovereignty or about human dignity are more or less shaped in the spirit and in line with what church defined for itself as a human dignity. And I find that the coincidences are telling. Naturally, it's not that judges, constitutional judges or Supreme Court judges are just rewriting what is written in the church documents, but I think that the message they get from the public sphere to what they should take as so guiding principles, so interpretative tools from this public sphere. So it is, if not shaped, if not determined, but at least largely influenced by the church. So it is more or less so.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So then if there are no other questions, we finish right on time. thank you, Michael, for your presentation, and thanks for your contributions also, and thanks again to Patrice. We can now conclude the panel here, and we'll see each other again at in half an hour at 4:30 with the panel on Islamic concepts of law and politics.
Let's start with any further ado, and this is a great pleasure to welcome you all back to the fourth panel of this conference for this afternoon. And very also interesting and important topic of Islamic conceptions of law and politics. And it is my very pleasure to welcome Jocelyn Cesari. Oh, don't you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Or did I misunderstand, Jocelyn? Because I thought you say. Okay, so if you can hear me, yeah, thank you. Jocelyn is will be the first speaker on and give us a presentation on Islamic concepts of law, politics, and sovereignty. And I'm really looking forward to her presentation, having had the chance already to read her paper, which she submitted in time. And of course, I could see also an exciting clash with some of the ideas and writings of Ahmed Kourou, who will be the final speaker in this panel, so that I think we can have a lively debate after the three presentations. And what I'm also interested very much from an Austrian perspective is her notion of political Islam. Because as you might know and have heard about, political Islam is a very hotly contested issue in the government coalition of the Austrian People's Party with the Green Party, and in particular the Austrian People's Party is very much inclined to fight political Islam. And why they fight political Islam from a different perspective than the Austrian perspective is very helpful for me, hopefully also to understand much better the Austrian situation. And having read the article and paper by Jocelyn already, she gives some definitional elements, the nationalization of Islamic institutions and clerics, and the incorporation of Islam in both secular legislation and the educational system, the public educational system, which she sees as the most important definitional elements of what she calls and conceptualizes as political Islam. By transforming, finally, the individual belief and consciousness of believers into some sort of political and criminal political acts in national legislation, where she highlights in particular apostasy and blasphemy, which we discussed already this morning and in the first panel and the second panel, as one of the problems. So without any further ado, thank you for joining us for this panel, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for inviting me for this nice presentation, and also thank you to Lucas, and both of you have worked hard to make this happen, so I'm very grateful to you. Without further ado, I will share my screen to show some slides. Do you see everything?
Yes, yes. It works very well. Thank you.
Okay. So the relation between Islam and politics has been debated in academic circles for several decades now. I remember getting in graduate school, which is long time ago, and we had already this discussion about Islam and lack of democracy. But the 9/11 events were a turning point in the sense that it became by then a topic of political debate across different segments and trend of political actors, and also it came very high on the agenda of international affairs. And the lens of the clash of civilization started to be the most important way to look at Islam and politics. What happened in the last 20 years is that the clash has been very much debunked, actually, or invalidated by scholarship of different kinds. Lots of data, surveys, analyses that show that there is no such a thing as a clash between civilization, but many more tensions and conflicts within what's so-called civilization, not to mention the harsh critique of not understanding what civilization is in the work of Huntington. What remains is the political importance of the clash for political actors of all kinds, not only Western, actually. My work has also shown that some Islamic actors use it in a very similar way, but with inverted values to fight against the West. So it would be rare nowadays to find a serious scholarship based on the idea that violence and authoritarianism are inherent to Islam. And the most sensible and recent work analyze the relation between states and Islam to address the shortcoming of democracy and human rights in Muslim societies. And in my paper, I referenced lots of this new work, and I think it's one of the most promising trend that has emerged, at least in the last 10 years. Some issues remain, however, and the most troubling is the taken for granted nature of the state, as if it were a given and fixed entity throughout historical periods and political contexts. And in this respect, the reference in the case of Islam of what I call, with pun intended, the Holy Trinity, Deen wa Dunya wa Dawla, that appear as early as the 10th century, is often used by lots of my colleagues to justify the loose use of the term state to refer to political authority. And here there is a confusion between state and political authority. The state is not any kind of political authority. And I will spare you the discussion on what Deen, what Dunya, what Dawla means if we look at religion in the Durkheimian way of a concept of religion as the sum of the social and political institutions that give meaning and purpose to a community. So Dawla etymologically means cycle, and it came to define the passage of dynasties within the Muslim empires. It therefore referred to the power and authority of rulers to regulate and protect the revelation-based community. But it does not mean that the centralized and territorialized form of political power that we call state today. And that is why I think it's misleading to translate Dawla as state when referring to the pre-modern Islamic history. And generally speaking, in the debate about the nature of the state, and I also reference lots of discussion in the political science scholarship about that, I stand on the shoulder of a giant like Max Weber that considered and apprehended the state as the modern form of political power. From this perspective, the state is not defined not only by centralization of power or bureaucracy, because indeed you can find this feature in a lots of other polities, even pre-modern empires. The specificity of the state lies in its association with the nation as a political community founded on two principles. that do not appear anywhere else, and this I'm pretty confused, equality of individuals and sovereignty of the people. You can find one or the other. The two together give complete legitimacy to the state. And that's what defines a modern political community. So you cannot find any empire, any city, any tribe, any confederation before the nation state that are built on these two principles. It doesn't mean, however, that state and nation are synonymous or following the same development paths. Actually, lots of scholars like Stepan, Linz, Yadav have shown in several instances that the state precedes the nation, which is also actually very relevant for the topic of my talk, because that's the case for the nation state created on the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which were top-down creation initiated by the westernized state elites. This state-driven nation building is key to understand the existing features of Islamic law across Muslim majority countries. Any attempt to look back at Sharia in Muslim empire to explain its current political underpinnings bypasses decades, if not centuries, of institutional and ideational changes associated with the nation as a modern political community. So I just show this slide. I cannot get into very extensive details on the theoretical background, but my position is in the middle of a huge debate of what is a nation. Most scholars would agree today that a nation refers to a group with a collective identity and aspiration to self-determination. When the territorial borders of this group align with those of the state monopoly of power, we have the ideal type of a nation state. But then scholars completely disagree on how this kind of modern political community came to existence. And here you have this huge debate between the one that insists on the pre-existence of cohesive social groups grounded in culture, bloodline, religion, what you would call the primordialist, we say in French, sorry for not being able to say it better in English, and the one who considers that nationalism is a product of social processes that forge solidarity on the basis of shared communication and interest, so they are more on the constructivist aspect. In my opinion, this debate doesn't help very much to understand what the status of religion and specifically of Islam in a modern nation. And the position I adopt here is neither nor. Neither inherited features nor constructed communities are sufficient in themselves to create a nation. You need both. I do not contest that cultural, ethnic, and religious features of groups persist through successive historical periods. Such continuity, however, does not entail, and that's the most important point here, similarity or perpetuation of the meanings given to symbols, rituals, or practices since the foundation of the group. And that's what I'm going to show you is that the nation, because of these two principles of equality and sovereignty of people, completely changed or drastically changed the meaning of terms that were used before, like Sharia, Jihad, Maslaha, but they do not convey the same meanings that they did before the nation state. Again, I'm going to bypass here my method of approaching that, which is historical, conceptual history of terms, that meanings have changed, but the terms have remained, historical change of institutions, and the two combine give you a sense of this dynamic of tension between actors, ideas, and institution. And from this perspective, the nation, if I may give a definition, is a collective, consists of a collective consciousness and a set of institutions built on accumulated historical processes, continuously transforming what people see as inherent and essential features that make them say we. And again, this could be the case of any community, but for a political community based on equality and sovereignty, that's this continuous investment in terms that have not been changed. The terms remain, the investment in meaning has changed because of this building of the nation as a modern political community. The problem is, and this I had a long discussion with some friends, I wrote a paper on sacred sites in India and in Israel, and it was fascinating because Zion indeed is a traditional term. It is a revelation-based community granted by God. You find it in all the books and in all the prayers and in all the rituals. But Zionism refers to the modern nation. And the modern nation on which Israel is built, otherwise it doesn't exist internationally. There is no possibility, if you even don't pay lip service to equality and sovereignty of people, to exist internationally, okay? This modern nation doesn't invest the term Zion in the way that it was invested at the time of the second of the first temple. And if we don't understand that, we cannot get the tension politically around this issue. That's why tensions arise, because people do not agree. That's the basic of politics. When you compete between each other, when you compete to impose the right meaning and the right legitimacy, and I can go on and on. In my new book, I show the same process going on in India, in China, in Russia, and so it's not specific to Islam, in other words. So having said that, what happened in the time of nation building in Muslim countries? So in the same way, on the same logic, nation building in Muslim countries resulted in a decisive reorganization of the religious community political power interactions. In Muslim empires, Islamic institutions and clerics were financially and intellectually independent from the caliphal bureaucracy, even if it didn't prevent sultans to subjugate them at different historical periods. Nobody would contradict that. But it doesn't mean that because there is some kind of tug of war going on top of the caliphal bureaucracy, that religious clerics and institutions have lost independence. Actually, the submission was never totally accomplished for one key reason. And then the archives are rich about this case. Religious authorities, until the end of the Ottoman Empire, regulated local communities. So what does this mean? It means that you had, unlike what people think today, you had a community-centered Sharia, not a state-centered Sharia, and it makes a whole difference. Religious authority provided rulings for local communities, which included Muslims and other religious groups. In this respect, Islamic legislation was first and foremost aimed at the people, for the people, with no immediate consideration for the central political power. Islamic jurisprudence, which is at the core of the traditional conception of political order, law, and community, developed in the tension between the need for unified authority for the Islamic world and local established practices. This tension shaped the historical development of Islamic law and put the authorities in the hands of scholars rather than in the hands of those with political power. The Sultan was responsible for putting the law into effect to a certain extent, but he was never, ever responsible for formulating it. As such, there was a duality in the relationship between the Sultan and the law. Even when the unification of the judiciary under a single chief judge occurred in the late period of the Ottoman Empire, it didn't necessarily create a hierarchical system. In fact, individual provincial courts kept their autonomy. Again, there are tons of archives I have gone through about that, and the evidence are there. The local debate, the local responsibility of the judge was maintained for a long, long time, even if there was some change already going on that I don't have time to get into. And that is why, in contrast with the current conditions, Islamic law was hardly monolithic or not fixed. Most significantly, it was designed for the common good, maslaha. And that's again where conceptual history is fascinating. Today, you look at everywhere, scholars, clerics look at maslaha, and some clerics, not all of them, would say it's public interest. Maslaha etymologically doesn't mean public interest, because public interest means looking at the sake of central institutions. It was the common good of the community, which is different. And as noted by lots of scholars, maslaha should be translated as public interest only when it refers to the permissibility of the political authorities to issue rulings that concur with the public good within the sphere of siyasa or politics. But that was not the common meaning until the building of the nation state. And it's also interesting to see that until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the late period, you see emerging Sharia court, Siyasa court that were directly controlled by the Sultan and that were different from the Sharia court that remain under the purview of the Qadi or judge. Sharia and Siyasa operated in two different realms that could overlap or compete, but were not synonymous. So right there, you cannot say that in Islam, there is no difference between religion and politics. Otherwise, you cannot justify the existence of two tracks of court. And this is interesting because it's even before the nation state. So as I discuss in my book, we have here a sort of proto-secularization that we don't know would have been out of it if there was not been encounter with the nation as a modern political community. But I cannot extrapolate here. So what happened with the nation state? As the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the emergence of the state as a central political institution went hand in hand with the homogenization of the population inhabiting the nation's territory. And that's what we tend to forget. We should never look at the building of state institutions on their own. They also worked with the homogenization of the population. And here, this is the staple of nationalism studies. A nation is based on homogenization. What we have tend to neglect in the case of the Islamic history is the influence of this homogenization going hand in hand with the state institution on the redefinition of Islam. Again, if we look at the conceptual history, the Ummah that everybody today, even the majority of clerics, will define as a community of Muslim believers, this was not the dominant way of looking at the Ummah pre-nation state. The Ummah was the sum of the territories and populations under the Caliphate rule, encompassing an extensive distribution of ethnic, cultural, linguistic groups, all kinds of denomination of Islam, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrian, Bahia, and so on. So I always said, if I were Greek Orthodox in Istanbul before the nation state, I was part of the Ummah. This is gone, even from the imagination of Muslims that explain why ISIS can have the project of a unified, homogenized caliphate, because it's operating on this modern political understanding of the Ummah as a community of all Muslim believers. So the nation building systematically omitted and sometimes eradicated this pre-existing ethnic, religious, and linguistic diversity in order to create one nation defined by one religion and one language. Again, that's nothing specific to Islamic history. It happened in other contexts. What interests me is that in the case of Muslim countries born out of the collapse of the Muslim empire, it did change the investment in key terms of the Islamic tradition. And that this homogenization led to the politicized narrative on religion, which I call political Islam. So the particularity doesn't lie in the fact that the nation state redefines the rule of engagement between religion and politics. This happens everywhere. The architects of all new nation states have to determine to what degree the core collective identity of the country should be sacrificed in exchange for the imported institutions and technologies necessary to strengthen the state, both military and economically. And again, I have looked at this debate in other cases in China, India, and that's very resonating with what I'm trying to say here about Islam. But in the case of Muslim countries, Islam was an element of the new political community, independently of your religious belonging. And this emergence of new political norms tied to nationalism resulted in state narratives that either reference Islamic terminology or were articulated within an Islamic framework. But by doing that, they also completely changed the meaning of these terms that they were taking from the past. And here I just want to say one little thing about, because or maybe I mentioned it here. Yeah, rise on pan-Islamism and pan-Arabism. It is fascinating also to see how usually these two trends are seen as antagonistic. They differ in what is the link between people to be part of this modern political community based on equality. But they are not one modern and one traditional. Pan-Islamism is as modern as pan-Arabism. What pan-Islamists are saying is, we are building a new modern political community based on equality. The link with people will be Islam. The pan-Arabists are saying, we are building a new modern political community. The link between people will be culture and religion. And it's interesting that at the time, most of the traditional authorities were okay with pan-Islamism. Actually, they considered it more egalitarian than pan-Arabism that they saw as racist. Well, that's an interesting kind of a snippet here that I always find to look at this debate in their particular context. So most significantly, all secular nationalist leaders, because at the end of the day, the nationalist fight led to the victory of the secular nationalists, but it didn't mean that they ignore these debates going on the ground and the role of pan-Islamism as mobilizing people against the colonial power. So they never completely given up on looking at Islam as a way to maintain connection or build new connection between people. Overnight was said they were a nation. There was no Turkey. Overnight, Kemal Atatürk said, this is Turkey with this particular portion of territory, and in this territory, people are going to speak Turkish and they're going to be Muslim, even if Turkey didn't acknowledge Islam in the constitution. There was this taken for granted link between being Turk and being a Muslim. And the same thing happened in Pakistan. Overnight, people were said, here you are Pakistani and here they are Indians. So again, this is state-led building of a nation as a modern political community, something that in the West we don't think of because we have been educated, although it's also a myth that, you know, a nation came spontaneously from some kind of cultural, you know, fraternity, which is far from being the case, but that's beyond my point here. So what happened then? The nationalization of Islam meant a few things that never happened in Muslim empire. Nationalization of Islamic institutions and clerics, incorporation of Islam into the secular legislation to a certain point, the most significant being maintaining Islamic prescription for marriage, divorce, custody of children, but removing Islamic prescription from all other aspects of law. And of course, Islam in the education system as building the narrative of the new nation in connection or reference with Islamic history. And that's something that I've looked into the textbook, historic textbooks from my previous project of Turkey, Iraq under Saddam, Tunisia, Egypt. They use Islam, even if you are Copt, if you are a non-believer, you learn that your country has some kind of connection with Islam. Syria is also a fascinating case. So these are three pillars that had a consequence on the way that everybody, secular, Islamist, atheist, minorities, identify to the new political community. And that's what I call hegemonic Islam as the outcome of these three processes. There are four modes of subordination. I'm not going to get into because I think I have already exceeded my time. The elimination of financially independent religious institutions, the structural reorganization of courts that all went under the purview of the state bureaucracy, integration of Sharia court into the national court system, integration of religious education into national education, and that such clerics became civil servants while religious endowments and religious schools came under state control. For me, this is the beginning of political Islam. If this is not political Islam, then I don't know what is political Islam. What we call Islamism today is a second iteration of this politicization of Islam, because the Islamists do not contest that. They are very happy with that. What they want is more of this influence of Islam on part of the secular legal system that was not shaped by that. So it means penal court, it means other institutions, but they do not contest what is the basis for today, all forms of modern politics in Muslim majority countries. So I want to, maybe if I still have time, Joseph, you can stop me if I am, if I have already exceeded my time. No, maybe. Do I have time to show what this means?
You have 2 minutes for conclusions.
Okay, so I'm going to just talk about the shift of blasphemy, because that's exactly to show you the changes of meaning and the more intolerant position about state law, Sharia as state law. in the Quran, apostasy is mentioned, of course, several times, but trials in apostasy were rare in Islamic history because they required high witnesses and that to be defined as public acts. Consequently, they happen only if the act disrupted social order. In other words, there was a private-public distinction that conditioned the punishment to apostasy to its public dimension and not to the believer's sin. And I don't have time to accept, but today the fact that the state can enact punishment on the basis of not only apostasy, but blasphemy and heresy, 3 terms, by the way, that have different meaning in the Islamic tradition, that have completely been put together in the modern state legislation, means that the state punishes not only for a public act, but it does have consequences on the personal condition of the Muslim of the citizen, as a Muslim believer. So I will stop here. But what I want to finish on that is to show, and I hope that I have convinced you that the never-ending changes is what we have to look into. When people start disagreeing on what it means to be a member of a political community versus a religious community, what laws mean, sovereignty, and so on, that's why you can see this different investment in meanings of terms that actually remain the same. We talk about Sharia, Jihad, Maslaha, like under the Mamluk, but the meanings of these terms have radically been modified. And I stop here. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for your fascinating overview on these developments of the concepts, underlying concepts of Islam, and your final conclusions on the nationalization, which reminds me of the debate we had this morning already with Alessandro Ferrari, also with the renationalization of public space following, for instance, from the laïcité mechanisms and policies undertaken by French governments. Another possibility, of course, for comparison. But I will stop here and immediately ask for questions. Please, Henriette, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think
so. I think we will wait for some time. Will somebody? Yeah, Franz, please. Yeah.
It's dogs barking, so it's a little bit dangerous, yeah. But I can step in actually. So I do have 2 questions. One is regarding, so to say, the future development, and the second is more historical question. The first would be a kind of question, which is what are the consequences of your presidency? Which is what should happen, so to say, in Islamic context, in the Islamic world? Should they, for example, invent a new language? Because I mean, for example, the word dawla, whatever it meant in history, dynasties, and there's etymological explanation. Nowadays, is it used as the common term in an Arabic text for state? So should we reinvent, so to say, kind of new terminology to help this or improve the situation? And my second question is more historical. I mean, you were also pointing out that there were inner Islamic developments. You were speaking of proto-secularization, which is this model Sharia and Siyasa, for example. The question would be, of course, why didn't it work out? It's just because there was this kind of confrontation with the West, with the nation state, the import of this concept, or what was the reason why this didn't work out?
I didn't get the second question. What was the question?
Now, the second question, you were referring to a kind of history also, or a kind of proto-secularization in the Islamic world, based on this distinction between Sharia and Siyasa, for example, which was, as far as I understood, the kind of process within the Islamic world. And the question would be, this kind of proto-secularization, why didn't this develop further? Why didn't this work out, so to say? Was it just because the concept of nation state was imported, so to say, and this was a kind of end to this inner Islamic discussion, or what happened?
Yeah. So about Dawla, you're absolutely right. Everybody today use Dawla. My importance on the semantic evolution of Dawla is when we scholars look at explanation. It is not about today changing the current debate. You cannot go back, you know, as what we say, you never bath twice in the same river. It's impossible to go back. Today, this is the term and it's fine, but we cannot, as scholar said, that this situation is explained by the pre-modern time. This, you cannot do that because we are bypassing and actually completely erasing histories through which Muslims have gone, you know, so that's something has changed. We have to take this into account, but we cannot say that because Islam has always done this. It's like I was saying this to Joseph before. I have looked at this particular evolution in Christianity. Today, everybody will tell you that Christianity separates God and Caesar because it's said in the gospel. Yes, it's true, but nobody until the end of the war of religion looked at the gospel this way. Actually, I always look at this thesis defended in the middle of the war of religion by the student at La Sorbonne, saying that the Pope is the lieutenant of God on earth. Sounds familiar? It's because the state will take over the sovereignty of God that the church had to look back at the gospel to justify the separation. So that's a kind of historical, again, approach that we need as scholars to have. We cannot keep having this generic position on Islam, on Christianity. That's what I'm saying. The fact that today everybody invests Dawla, yeah, ISIS, Daesh, you know, this is the point is not to say that's wrong. The point is to explain where does this come from, because at the end of the day, the radical Islamic take great advantage of presenting themselves as traditional, while they are not. They are not traditional. They are the result of a modernity. And if we as scholars cannot object to that, I have an issue with that because it's beyond scholarship. It's about also civic responsibility. I am okay that young people and policymakers and media take them at face granted, take them, you know, at face value at what they are saying. I cannot do that. So that's my response to you on Dawla. About the proto-secularization, I have been fascinated. You may be fun. That's fascinating. I cannot extrapolate. I know that these debates were happening. And then the encounter, and again, it was not war as such. It's fascinating. Bonaparte going to Egypt, 1798. That's why you see the intellectual debate starting, never ended until now. And it's all about, so what do we do in this new configuration of modernity? And it was not negative. Everybody was in favor of imitating the West, even and especially the pan-Islamist one. But then it was complete, these pre-existing trends were completely reordered by the necessity to address this question of equality and sovereignty of people, all of them, which was not present in the differentiation between Siyasa and Sharia. Both at the end of the day were still operating under a hierarchical system. The empire was far from being egalitarian, and the sovereignty of people was not even discussed. So you see what I mean? I cannot say that that it has a nice, linear, smooth continuation. Something was reordered by the encounter with the West. But again, that's not specific to Islam. It happened in all. Every group gets through this reorientation. You see, it's, so I don't know if I responded to your question, but.
Thank you so much. Then Henriette, now you have the floor.
Okay, they were very kind all day long. It's only now. So, first of all, thank you. I think it was a very rich presentation that raised many, many ideas that I had going on in my mind. And I am glad that you have mentioned women in the end, because I think it's a critical issue in the Muslim world that transformed everything, politics as well as the Sharia and the siyasa and the Sharia, let's say. In two studies that I have done recently, first of all, there is a debate regarding the wilaya and wisaya. I don't know if you're familiar with them. You probably are familiar. Escorting the women when they are going out. It could be a 10-year-old child. Because he is male, he is escorting his grown-up sister, a professor somewhere, and this is an absurd situation that women in Saudi Arabia are contesting it. To what extent it contests it in order to transform the convention of the perception of Islam or practicing Islam. That's one point that I would like to hear what you have to say about it. The other one is going on here in Israel in the Islamic movement. The Islamic movement now accepts many women in political positions, and this contradicts in a way the Muslim laws or the Quran, the Quran resources. We have, for example, women heading the municipalities, women doing all kinds of jobs that are in a way contradicting the understanding of the faith, and this create a debate, a major public debate between men and women within the Muslim movement. So this is another point that I'm very curious to hear your opinion about, how it transforms the Muslim world and well, of course, nationalism in Israel is too complex, so I will not enter into it. Perhaps tomorrow when
We need another conference for that.
Yeah, that's right. But anyway, thank you for the talk, and I would like to hear what you think of my points.
Yes, no, thank you. You are bringing something that is key, which is the status of women in all this debate about law and modernity. So you are pointing out to the Saudi Arabia situation. And I always say, if you look at Muslim majority countries today, Saudi Arabia is an outlier when it comes to women's rights. We should never take them as the, again, authentic Islam. Wahhabism is a modern reform, not modernist. It's reformist, but it is reading the Quran and the Hadith in a way that is not traditional. And interestingly, if you look at the debate, for example, on niqab, on what you are just mentioning, the necessity of being chaperoned everywhere, because some migrants from Muslim majority countries go to Saudi Arabia or the Gulf, and they face this situation. So the established authority, for example, in Egypt, there have been, before the 2001 revolution, it was fighting against the niqab and this infantilized position of women. There was a Bill of Rights for women issued by Al-Azhar in 2010 or right before the Arab Spring, saying that women have the right to education, they have the right to vote, they have the right to be elected, they have the right to work. So that's the tradition, okay? Does it mean that...
But not leading, just one comment, not leading the prayer in the mosque, which exists in the United States.
No, it doesn't. Oh my. In the United States, Amina Wadud with an African-American woman. So she comes from a very, I would say, American background. She led once, and I'm going to tell you, even traditional educated Pakistani women, Lebanese, they say, we don't want that. But these are two different things, Henrietta. We cannot mix all of this. In terms of what you could call individual rights, meaning job, education, and politics, there is nothing in Islam that prevents women to get there. If we look at what we call the rights of the self, which mean my status in the marriage, my status vis-a-vis custody of children and so on, then you are right, the prescription of Islam are still present, and they have been actually included in the so-called secular legislation. In Tunisia, that was under Bourguiba and Ben Ali, the most secular Muslim country after Turkey. If I were a Tunisian citizen female, I could not give the nationality to my son, because in Islam, the husband gives, the man gives the religion and the name. So that's the kind of thing that we have to distinguish. You know, even in Iran, we think women are completely oppressed. Women outnumbered men in the education system. They are professional. Again, because we have to distinguish individual rights, there is nothing against women taking all this responsibility. But as I joke with some of my Iranian friends, you can run for president, and actually some try, but you cannot divorce your husband. You see what I'm saying here? And I think that's the kind of distinction we have to make. So you're absolutely right. The women body, that's where the conflict is. The sexuality, the marriage, that's a highly contested side today. But you know, I live in the US. Right now, the Supreme Court has just maybe agreed that abortion can be illegal. You see what I mean? That's, for me, that's the same kind of debate that is happening in lots of countries about the capacity of women, not only to act as social actors, but to be the master of their own body. And that's something where religion, all of them, have not given up. And we have been mistaken by our vision of modernity that this will go away. This doesn't go away. And it's happening in Christianity, it's happening in Islam, it's happening in Judaism too. It's something that is everywhere. The problem is that in Muslim countries, where the state has taken this prerogative of hegemonic Islam, we tend to think that it's because of Islam. You see what I mean? While there are spaces where this question can be discussed in a way that doesn't automatically serve a political agenda. So, but I completely agree. For me, that's the topic of to look into. What do women, and not to be only discussed, how religious women are also part of this debate, you know, and why we do not include them enough in this debate. And second, what was your, the Islamic movement. Yes, so, from what I say, the Muslim Brothers are not the Salafi Wahhabi, okay? They have no problem with women taking political responsibility. So it's not a surprise that they can be involved in this movement. It would be different if we were dealing with Salafi or neo-Salafi Wahhabis. It has been shown in Egypt, for example, when the Muslim Brothers were very strong socially, you could see the presence of women in lots of actions, and they were, you know, claiming it. You have this what's called this Islamic feminism that has been developed also in Iran and in other Muslim countries. But these women, at the same time, would not be comfortable, as you mentioned, with Amina Wadud leading the prayer. So there are this kind of disconnection that we from the West tend to put all together, you know, like women's rights, it comes all together in a nice package. Actually, it doesn't. Some people are ready with some aspects.
Allow me to make one more comment, just short.
Sorry, I really have to stop your conversation to give Dino Abazovic also a chance. So only a short sentence, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I only want to mention one name, Saba Mahmoud, and the mosque in Egypt, which is also very active. So I think it does not conform to exactly to what you just said, if you can make another comment. But I'm sorry, Joseph, it's very interesting.
No, I cannot go on that. It will take too long, but I don't think that it but okay, To be
so you can
exchange
you can exchange probably via email or via the chat function your different perspectives. And may I ask you also to look into the chat, because there is one question raised to you, Jocelyn. And with having said that, that you may hopefully be able to answer that in a few short sentences. We will finish, and I will turn over now the floor to Dino Abazovic. But before I come to that, I have completely forgotten, due to our talk before we started the panel, that to introduce Jocelyn. She holds the chair of religion and politics at the University of Birmingham, and she's also a senior fellow at the Georgetown University at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And there are several very prominent positions as president-elect of the European Academy of Religion, 2018-2019. And what we were discussing before we started the panel is also her upcoming book, which will come out within the next weeks, as far as I understood, on We, God's People, Political Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism in the World of Nations, with Cambridge University Press. And I'm really looking forward to learn much more from your fascinating research. Therefore, I come now to Dino Abazovic, a very good old friend of mine. He's professor at the University of Sarajevo, the Faculty of Political Sciences, and he's a specialist also for the sociology of religion, doing a lot of research, not only on the Southeast European countries, and I had the honor and pleasure to work together with him in two research projects from 2008 to 2010 within the framework of the 6th EU framework program on human rights and minority rights in the phases of conflicts. And we were trying to figure out what role does religion play in the wars in the Balkans. And we had started with a discussion already before a little bit. What does Orthodoxy and Catholicism, which role do the church leaders play today in constitutional debates in Bosnia-Herzegovina, ongoing constitutional debates today in Bosnia-Herzegovina? And in this respect, we had also a common project on interreligious dialogue in Bosnia-Herzegovina with politicians, civil servants, from various ministries and the church representatives, which was very fascinating to see also the differences within the religious denominations. For instance, within Catholicism, we speak always about Catholicism, but there is a huge differentiation within Catholicism, at least in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But before I start to talk about all this, the floor is, of course, Dino's. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Marco. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really my pleasure and honor to be here with all of you. It has been a long day, and I will try to make it as concise as possible, my presentation and discussion that will bring us, I would say, a little bit closer to what we have been listening this morning, and of course what is expected from me in this particular context. I will try to share my presentation, so just let me know whether you are able to see that I'm just a little bit more concise and precise in that respect. Do you see my slides?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So basically what I prepared within the scope of this conference and project was titled as Historicizing the Secularization Debate. And I hope it will be some helpful illustration from Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is not necessarily only the case study of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In the longer version of my chapter for this conference or paper, it will also have some reflection on Bosnia and Herzegovina. but inspired by these very thoughtful presentations by Professor Cesari, I will also, if there is a few minutes left after all of this, share some experience from case of Bosnian Islam, because I think it could be useful food for thought for discussions we just listened. So basically, what I have been trying to do is to do, as a sociologist of religion, a little bit of debates about secularization in general, not necessarily only as we heard this morning, but a little bit more about this, what I'm entitling as 3 different phases: early sociological debate and secularization debate that was basically abundant, including its founding fathers. Let's say most of you are, I'm sure, familiar how Peter Berger in 90s basically rejected everything he has been writing about secularization in 60s and 70s. Then I also briefly discuss interesting case from neo-secularist or post-secularist, if you like, those who were basically involving into the theory, this rational choice theory approach to religion, or even economy theory into the religion, so including the Bainbridge, Yanacon, Stark, and others. And as much as it is a little bit more American parochial, I would say, theory, it is quite interesting to see to what extent we can learn from rational choice theory, although I do not agree with their basic premises. And of course, then I have been discussing this neo-secularism or neo-secularization debate that I find it very much useful, in particularly when it's come to the issue that certainly we do not necessarily need to define the secularization in sense of against or something that is sharply anti-religious, but rather we should look about centrality of institutional differentiation at the societal level. So basically what we learned, or at least I try to be a descriptive, not normative, is that in any given context, the data about individual beliefs, practices, and devotions do not discount the differentiation of religion from other institutions, in particular, in some cases, economy, state, education, or family. However, in order to cover all of these things, of course, it would be impossible in such a short period of time. Therefore, I would go to the central argumentation that I basically try to develop. And this is based on Philip Gorski, historicizing secularization debate premises. And for you of those who are not maybe familiar with that particular part of his work, actually Gorski already in 2003 proposed a very interesting approach, which I find it very useful in discussing Southeast Europe, and in particular Bosnia and Herzegovina case, in particular having in mind that some of the authors usually basically take into the consideration primarily so-called socio-political perspective. And within the socio-political perspective, when it's come to the state and faith, focus lies in the conflict and competition between religious and non-religious elites or movements, if you like. But then again, there are others who are more or less going from the religio-cultural perspective, and in that sense, focus is on relationship between religious and non-religious values and worldviews. And it's really fine. There is a vast literature going on about that. But what could be a very much useful, I would say, is exactly what Gorski proposed, and this is the elements of historicizing the secularization debate. Having said that, I will remind you that basically we're supposed to have in mind a couple of points. In this particular case, these are 4, and they are prior to all taking into the account that we need to adopt a little bit of longer range and fully encompassing historical perspective that extend well beyond the modern era. And I think from Professor Cesari, we already heard to what extent this could be very useful in rethinking position we are currently now. Then we're supposed to engage in more serious and sustained way with the relevant historical sources and literature, so as to develop a clear sense of the temporal and spatial contour of secularization in all of its dimensions. Again, leave aside how we do define that, because to remind you, Malcolm said that basically definition of secularization depends how you define religion. And most probably we will never agree about one commonly accepted definition of that, but it is much more better to be focused how we apply that to particular case studies. We also supposed to view secularization as contingent outcome of particular events involving the very particular actors. And finally, we need to be more sensitive to changes into the context and context of religious practices and beliefs. When I try to think about these things in contemporary moment of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Southeast Europe as well, that's kind of the euphemism for former Yugoslavia, or politically correct to say former Yugoslavia, more or less. We will find out that from 1990s onward, more than in other parts of Central Europe in particular, these so-called countries in transitions are at the same moment witnessing the translation of the social religious identities into very solidified political identities. And obviously religion becomes a very hard political fact. In a certain sense, so-called post-secular processes we have been discussing this morning also enhance the creation of religious identities that are linked with the political disputes, instead of supporting something that might be merged into various other cultural identification and practices. Why I find that particularly important? In particular because these consequences of so-called global events, these post-secular or even post-sovereign that we now discuss processes, basically predate the never fully developed authentic process of secularization. And in case of former Yugoslavia, in particular of Bosnia and Herzegovina, that was a basically socialist period of Yugoslavia, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, where we have a kind of authentic secularization processes, although the first years, in particular immediately after the World War II, were certainly the periods where there was very much state-protected atheization to a certain extent, but not as in some other Soviet Union or former Soviet countries. Yugoslavia was a case for itself, and in that sense, obviously, we can still learn or some lessons in that respect. Be that as it may, what I find very evident is to remind us what Charles Taylor writes in his chapter published in Han de Vries edited volume Religion Beyond the Concept, when he basically claimed, and I concur, that political identities can be woven around religious and confessional definitions. So in course of modern history, these particular confessional allegiances have come to be woven in the sense of identity of certain ethnic, national, class, or regional group. In case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but Croatia and Serbia in particular, also, I would say it is prior to ethno-national concept in the sense that ethno-national entrepreneurs are actually using religion in order to achieve non-religious goals. And in that respect, we would say that some people might call it instrumentalization of religion, misuse of religions, you name it, but it is obviously something rather different. It is actually something I called that identities, confessional or religious identities, and ethno-national or political identities are collapsing into each other, and then basically we're getting into the situation that the majority of population is losing capability or possibility to distinguish the two. And such an intellectual confusion in post-conflict societies in Bosnia and Herzegovina is, I hope there is no reason to remind you, is still very much post-conflict society struggling with the wars of 90s, with the consequences of the war. And in that respect, I find it very, very important to make a distinction between two identities. However, it is not only a matter of local development, it's also quite something that is going on into these recent debates about Europe, this rise of new populist right-wing movements and so on and so forth. Discussion of, or never-ending discussion about European Islam is there also very much into the question. So all this is to a certain extent reflecting upon the Bosnia and Herzegovina, having in mind that this is a historically very multi-religious and multi-confessional country and state, and in that respect, I would say even more fragile, and we need to take that into the additional scrutiny. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, as always, today such legitimized political identities, meaning those that are coded in religious categories, they are transformed, but however, on daily level, they are insisting, or their careers insisting that they are a matter of tradition, continuity. Actually, they are not. They are completely new politically built identity in the matter of recent time. And what is to a certain extent worried and frightening is that antagonism based on religious identity today are growing stronger. In particularly having in mind that there is a fact that proponents of such an antagonism consider them as a tool for religious identitarian self-confirmation. So basically, to self-confirm your own religious identity is to be antagonized towards a significant other. In particular case here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, this is along a Christian-Muslim relationship. Jewish identity in that matter is not so into the case. Simultaneously, I will remind you that religious freedoms are understood exclusively as one owns freedom and not that of the other. In that respect, Jose Casanova was, as I can recall, and that to a certain extent resonate to what also Professor Jocelyn has been mentioning earlier, was speaking about role and the place of Islam in Europe, and remind us that we're supposed to think about something that he coined unspoken cultural requirements of being European. And in that sense, as long as we are not able to discuss, or as we are not willing to engage into discussion what those unspoken cultural requirements are, I would say that we will see more and more of this antagonism, and this antagonism often ended up into the case that these so-called radical groups of religiously based movements, or these new religio-political groups, if you like, basically use religious freedoms as a carte blanche for unsanctioned religious practices. And it doesn't matter anymore what religious authorities have to say, what ecclesial communities keep repeating, either quoting or non-quoting holy scripts and so on and so forth. Obviously, that what we are witnessing is that these traditional religious authorities are getting under the challenging the monopoly of different voluntaristic and partisan religious-based groups who are actually, thanks to the globalized world and thanks to this new media and everything else, challenging their monopoly and trying to influence or to certainly present some of their agenda into this line. So in terms of all of this, what I try to develop is basically a new understanding of these so-called post-secular, prior to genuine secular developments into these countries in transition, and the challenges they are faced when it's come to political instrumentalization of religious identities. I would say that Bosnian Islam in that case is particularly interesting to look at, because often we can hear that Bosnian Muslims are autochthonous European Islam community, that they are there through the long-term process of Islamization as a legacy of Ottoman Empire, blah, 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 in this sense. But however, I would just like to draw you for a couple of very interesting discussions about these notions, what actually Islam from Bosnia, or Bosnian Islam, is to a certain extent presenting, or how it could be interpreted in the line of my previous argumentation. Let me remind you that Professor Tel Al-Assad was writing in one of his works about this very interesting case of Bosnian Islam, and actually he was referring to interview that at that time Tadeusz Mazowiecki, who was a UN Special Rapporteur for Commission on Human Rights for the Balkans, who resigned because of what was happening in Bosnia during the war, and in particularly he was resigned, having in mind the war crimes and genocide happened against Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina, have been giving the interview to New Yorker review of the books. And interviewer asked Mazowiecki something along following question: how you as a Polish Catholic are so sympathetic towards the Bosnians, among them majority are the Muslims, or something like that. And then this very famous Mazowiecki assumption was something that triggered Talal Asad to write about these things, having in mind that Mazowiecki replied into that interview, you can find it and of course read it, that he is very much surprised that at the end of the 20th century, Europe is still incapable of coexistence with the Muslim community. And Muslim community in this particular sense was Bosnian Muslim. And then Assad himself, Talal Asad, concluded that basically, unfortunately, reading that discussion, you can find out that Bosnian Muslims may be in Europe, but not of it. And that is a problem. Certainly, majority of Bosnian Muslims do not consider themselves being only in Europe, but being of Europe in all possible sense of meaning, in particularly when you take into the consideration that very, very small Bosnian community of Muslims, small compared to the rest of Muslims living in Europe, however, having a very interesting legacy into that respect and have something to offer. And I would say, rephrasing Olivier Roy, who said that Dar al-Islam is actually not a territory anymore, it is environment to a certain extent of meaning, is that, at least from the case of Bosnian Muslims, our panel is entitled about Islam in that respect, and therefore that's why I'm insisting into this question, is that it is possible to develop a very genuine religious organization that can diffuse radicalism. And in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that was the case even during the worst period of conflict. Actually, believers every day, Bosnian Muslims was the biggest obstacle of radicalizing Bosnian Muslims. So none of the Bosnian mosques or masjids and any other are not under the control of anybody but officially recognized and the only sole institution of Bosnian Muslims. But it's also about Sharia in the secular state. And Professor Fikret Karčić, who was the scholar of Bosnian scholar of Muslim legal practices and everything else, argues quite rightly that legal norms in secular state in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bosnian Muslim case, are very much interesting, having in mind that basically you can have them through the secular state. However, the Sharia legal norms are transformed into the ethical ones. So these transformations really happened during the 20th century, and it is not anymore a question, so to say, here, and giving the good example how it could be developed in a case of cherishing tradition of this particular community as Bosnian Islam in that case is. On the end of the day, I would just would like to remind you that basically what we should be focused to a certain extent is that religiosity is changing, not religion itself. It is not what of belief, but how of belief is changing very much. And certainly these cases from Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, or in particular in Bosnia and Herzegovina, could be a very good example of one particular case study and have some helpful illustrations for at least the European case. So having said that, I don't know, I think, yeah, that was my timer, that my 20 minutes is off. Yeah. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will gladly answer any question if you have them. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dino, for this presentation. And again, we have a few minutes left before we switch over to Ahmed Kuru, who has meanwhile joined us. Welcome also to our conference. And who would like to raise a question concerning Dino's presentation? Otherwise, I would be very interested, because this is in somehow overlapping but different from Tariq Moudud's ideas of multicultural nationalism. When you outline here also this belonging to groups and that this is confused, conflated, or however you would define it, or fused with confessions and belief systems, so that in the end you have very, very strict boundaries in terms of ethno-religious groups, which behave in the same way as what we were discussing all day already, in terms of nationalization of public space and the fragmentation of public space, and that public space becomes more and more conflict prone. So is there a way out to prevent this nationalization with the danger of being turned into antagonism and in the end fragmentation of societies? Because Tariq Moudud seems to see the solution in ethno-religious groups and the coexistence of ethno-religious groups.
Yeah, I do understand the position. However, what I try to emphasize is that unfortunately this reduction of universal identities towards the particular ethno-national identities are basically the birthplace of politicizing religion, if you like. So in that respect, I would say that it simply doesn't matter anymore to what extent we hope that religion is a conversation starter. On the end of the day, obviously, on the condensed political arena or public space nationalized in that way, religion remains to be a quintessentially difference. So in that sense, ethnopolitical and religious entrepreneurs, as I have been mentioning, are basically cannot use the potential of religious teaching, if you like, or religious universal claims anymore, having in mind that this is reduced to something that is a particular group political identity. And the case from Bosnia and Herzegovina sharply said that, sharply, so to say, is evidential point where these conversation stopper, as Rorty called them, are on the stake when actually conversations cannot go anymore, because they invoke the final truths in a sense that is basically antagonizing public space, not opening to it. So in that respect, I'm not, from the experience and the case study of Bosnia and Herzegovina, I'm not really sure this is the way how to go. Okay.
Thank you. Then Ahmed is the next on my list of speakers. And before we come to his presentation, he would also like to raise a question to you. Please go ahead. You have to, yeah.
Thank you, Joseph, you all and all organizers. And it is still 8:30 a.m. here in San Diego. Therefore, I missed Joseline's presentation, unfortunately, and I am looking forward to the volume when it's published. I'll be happy to read all the presentations I miss because of the time difference. Very brief question to Dino, comparing Bosnia and Turkey. In Turkey, for various reasons, there has been an obsession with homogenization. Unfortunately, we lost the Greek, Armenian, and other Christian populations with tragedies, massacre, genocide, whatever you call. But the result is that more homogenization brings more intoleration. And then whenever I mention this, some people bring this case of Bosnia, saying that, look, there were substantial heterogeneity, Muslim, Orthodox, Catholics, different ethnic groups, but it didn't produce toleration. Mm-hmm. So could you, I know it's very complex, but very briefly, could you tell us that despite the fact that people know diverse ethnic religious existence, they didn't become tolerant? And can you just briefly give me an insight about this Turkey-Bosnia comparison? Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed, for the question. Well, how I view that from the purely my sociological, but also my living experience. It is not necessarily always the case, as you might know, as it is presented or has media presentation and other reports are telling. I wouldn't say that there is a lack of tolerance in that respect. Everyday people, in this particular sense of meaning, are actually looking, in this vast socio-anthropological research shows having the very same common interest, and they on everyday life disapprove thesis that there is a lack of tolerance and so on and so forth. The communal relationship and rebuilding of the everyday life, despite what has been happening during the war, actually proven the politicians and decision makers to be wrong. So nothing is wrong with the everyday people. They still do seeking the normalcy. They still do having interconfessional, international, interethnic relationship that going beyond these hard political identities and so on and so forth. The problem is that unfortunately legal settings is just recognizing these hard ethno-national / religious identities as the only ones who have the political relevance. So in that sense, it is impossible to build cross-ethnic and cross-religious politics, having in mind that state framework and constitutional framework preventing them do so. That's the problem. The second issue is, I would say, in that respect, is that unfortunately, state as such, although providing the legal framework, including the state law on religious rights and freedoms, basically so far having the relationship with the Catholic Church, thanks to the international concordat, or meaning the international agreement between the Vatican and State of Bosnia and Herzegovina. With Serbian Orthodox Church, there is also the agreement between the state and Serbian Orthodox Church, which is bilateral, so to say, having in mind that Patriarch is in Belgrade. But State of Bosnia and Herzegovina never signed the agreement with the Islamic community in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and is still pending. So far, publicly, we really don't know what is the reasons why that is going on. However, of course, there are some hints why this is going on, and this is never-ending story about all things are happening in Europe as well. It is a hijab or niqab issues, there is Ramadan issues, and so on and so forth. But in terms of the tolerance, I know that a number of the scholars would say that organized religion is a negative example of religious institutions working in the peace building, reconciliation, and so on and so forth. But on the daily life, and when you see how the people act on the everyday life, obviously that is not a paramount obstacle to building the multi-confessional societies. The framework, unfortunately, does not provide that to be politically implemented into country as this one is. I hope I just provide a little bit of answer to that.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much also for the response. Are there any additional questions? I don't see any hands raised. Then it is my pleasure again to announce Ahmed Kuru's presentation for tonight here in Graz and in Central Europe, but good morning in San Diego. He is Porteus Professor of Political Sciences at San Diego State University, has received his PhD from University of Washington and held several posts at Columbia University, for instance. And we mentioned already this morning this categorical distinction between passive secularism and assertive secularism in the comparison between Turkey, France, and the US. And now you have written and published a new book. And again, here we had already started to discuss your hypothesis that what Jocelyn has called the proto-secularism of early Islam simply broke down through state building and nation building processes and which led to some sort of homogenization of the political community. But you argue in your book that this happened much earlier by the ulema-state alliance, which prevents creativity and competition in Muslim countries, and which happened already at the beginning of the 12th and 13th centuries. That this proto-secularism was abolished by this fusion of the clergy, the ulema on the one hand, and the political authorities on the other hand. So we are really looking forward to your presentation and to an interesting debate.
Thank you very much again. Yeah, Joseph, to you and University of Graz and EURAC and all other friends, participants and organizers. Let me share my PowerPoint presentation with you. So if you allow me and authorize to share.
Yeah, you simply make use of the...
So as you will see in the presentation, I'm talking about a global problem in both Western societies and Muslim majority societies. But let me start verbally that in both Western and Muslim majority societies, we have the global problem of right-wing populism. And I see it in dialectical relationship with the challenge of expansion of religious diversity. These religious and nationalistic components of right-wing populism is very intriguing because historically, there was a clash between nationalist forces and religious forces in different parts of the world. But today, in many cases, from Turkey's Erdogan to India's Modi, to Russia's Putin, to the United States' Donald Trump, you see the combination of religious and nationalistic sentiments in right-wing populism. And in this presentation, I will try to explain how right-wing populists react to religious diversity, and there is a dialectical relationship between them in both Western and Muslim societies. Yeah. Despite the fact that right-wing populism is a common phenomenon in both regions, the West and the Middle East, and the Muslim world overall, there is, of course, variation both among Western countries and among Muslim majority societies. And in between them, let me make a very broad generalization, which is that if we go to the previous slide, Joseph. Now, the variation is obvious, and let me categorize in two different emphases. One emphasis in the West now for right-wing populists, we have anti-immigrant sentiments and Islamophobia. For the Muslim world, however, the main problem is not, of course, immigration, because there is no others coming. In fact, they are leaving. But the main problem now is sectarianism. Right-wing populists in Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, they are Sunni sectarian. And those in some countries like Iran, they are Shia sectarian. And they use anti-Westernism as an ideological tool and blame the West as a scapegoat. What is the solution? In both cases, the solution is citizenship, to give every citizen equal rights and opportunities with no discrimination. How can we reach to that goal? For the conference topic, law, religion, society, and state, we may assume law as the solution, and we have many legal experts among us. But I would challenge the idea saying that law, in fact, is not a neutral instrument. Law itself is an arena of ideological struggles. It's shaped by ideology. As we have seen, for example, Donald Trump's Muslim ban was an legal and executive attempt discriminatory. In just last July, the French Assembly passed a law called anti-separatism law, which was discriminatory to certain religious freedoms, especially for Muslims. So law is not neutral, it's shaped by ideologies. So then I would ask the question, what is the source of this ideological debate, ideological struggles? For various scholars, there is an inherent tension between Islam and Christianity regarding their history, regarding their impact on policy and ideology. It's not simply populist ideologues on the ground, but also in academia. There is this assumption that Islam inherently rejects religion-state separation, whereas Christianity is inherently upholding that. So in my new book, Islam, Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment, I try to examine this cliché, Islam versus Christianity debate, and try to show that, if we can move to the next slide, please, that religions, political interpretations are based on certain political and socioeconomic factors. There are certain historical dependencies and critical junctures. And they are, of course, multivocal. In Christianity, for example, Eastern churches never accepted church-state separation. Even in the West, before the 11th century, the so-called Gregorian reform, there was no separation between church and state. Holy Roman emperors imposing certain ideas and appointing bishops and popes. At the time in the Muslim world, however, there was certain level of separation between religious and political authorities, which became the basis of the so-called Muslim Golden Age. But for various political and religious reasons, the 11th and 12th centuries became a critical juncture where the reversal of religion-state relations occur. In the Muslim world, what I call ulama-state alliance emerged after the 11th century, whereas in Western Europe, an opposite direction was taken by the institutionalization of church-state separation to a certain degree. If you look at the next slide, during the Muslim Golden Age, we have the data collected by Cohen and others, and many biographies show us that between 8th to mid-11th centuries, overwhelming majority of Muslim scholars that we call ulama were independently and privately funded. And in Cohen's analysis, only 9% accepted to be judge and prosecutors and other state servants. But later on this change, and next slide show us that in the ulama state alliance emerged in the Seljuk Empire, starting with mid-11th century, Nizamiye madrasas, referring to Prime Minister Grand Vizier Nizam al-Mulk. This madrasa chain produced ulama to a certain extent that they became state servants. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sunni ulama state alliance was very much established under the Sheikhul Islam, today's Diyanet's historical origin. In the Shia world, Safavi ulama state alliance institutionalized, and today in Iranian system, the supreme leader, Velayat Faqih and everything show the supreme level of the ulama and state alliance and partnership. Whereas in the Western world, as the next slide show us, that a secular path was taken. In Europe, I explain in the paper, and let me very briefly mention here, that the Protestant nations vernaculized a la Benedict Anderson. The church authorities, Anglican Church, Lutheran Church in Scandinavian countries, in Netherlands and in the UK, either religious diversity or state church. Wherever Catholic authority emerged, it produced anti-clericalism, and more paramount example is obviously France. And what I call assertive secularism, laïcité de combat, in France emerged with the revolution, but it took over a century for it to be institutionalized. And finally, in 1905, with the separation law, there was the institutionalization. With certain reforms and modification, it reached today and became a basis of certain discriminatory laws against Muslims today. Whereas in the American experience, there is no ancien regime, as I explained in my earlier book, 2009, neither a local monarchy nor a hegemonic religion in American colonies eventually produce a different notion of secularism, what I call passive secularism, where state does not exclude religion from the public sphere, and the state does not impose secularism as a comprehensive doctrine, a la John Rawls. And this debate, unfortunately, reflected in the Muslim world only in the assertive dimension. And as the next slide will show us, that in the Muslim world, after the foundation of the Turkish Republic by Atatürk and his cadre, there was a very secular trend. Primarily assertive and authoritarian secularism became dominant. In Turkish, assertive seculars, Kemalism, in Iranian Shah, Baas regime in Syria and Iraq, Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, several secularist leaders with different degrees of assertiveness and authoritarianism. But in the last 40 years, starting with the Iranian Revolution, then Zia-ul-Haq declaration of Sharia in Pakistan, then the Egyptian state's embracement of LSR and Islamic law and putting Sharia in the constitution in 1980, even in Turkey, now the dominant regime is a populist Islamist regime. And this Islamization of public sphere, public discourse, and legal system create a real variation in the Muslim world today. Many countries have secular constitutions, many others have Sharia in the constitutions, but overall, there is a very strong Islamization in the public discourse that I am expecting a secularist backlash that we are seeing now, that many public surveys are showing that the young generations are living Islam. Deism is becoming more and more influential in Turkey. About 50% Iranians in a recent survey say they are no longer Muslim. In the Arab world, BBC reported secularization trend, and there may be a new trend. So as a normative position, I don't want to see another assertive secularist trend in the Muslim world, because that will mean an infinite cycle between assertive secularist authoritarianism, Islamist authoritarianism, and a circle between them. So the next slide will show us that even in Turkey, even the secularist French laïcité type background, now there is a very strong ulema-state alliance and Erdogan regime using this discourse. And the next slide shows us that the question, yes, passive secularism seems to be better for Western societies. That's what I argue, especially given the fact that the anti-immigrant sentiment and Islamophobia in France and certain countries, leading restrictive policies, headscarf ban, and in the recent law in France, they banned headscarves even for bus drivers. And the French President Macron came up with the idea that they need to create a new enlightened Islam. But if passive secularism is the solution, can it be done in the Muslim societies? Can it be a solution for sectarianism and anti-Westernism, reaching the goal of citizenship, shaping the law more inclusionary manner? So let me conclude by saying that I would argue that passive secularism is a middle ground between assertive secularism and Islamism, not Islamophobia, Islamism, is possible in the Muslim societies because Islam has a history of religion-state separation for about 4 centuries between 8 and 12. Muslim scholars has a historical and theoretical background about separating religious and political authorities, but it has been forgotten. That needs to be reminded and emphasized again. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Ahmed, and I'm quite sure that you will have a lot of questions. Who is going to raise the first question? Tariq is back.
Thank you, Joe.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Greetings, Emma. Thank you for your paper. Good to connect with you through this conference. So I think, you know, you're making great strides in such a kind of global, or at least intercontinental, inter-civilizational arguments, the way that you're tying things together. It's very impressive. But I wonder if some of the categories that you're using are too condensed, that you're packing too much in to the particular categories I'm interested in are assertive secularism and passive secularism. So I certainly see the difference between the two, and I see the difference between your account of French laïcité and your American account, as in your book and other publications, and I think they're very insightful. You bring out the ideological element in the historical transformations very well. I like that. What I really want to question is whether your term passive secularism is sufficiently enlightening in relation to the different kinds of political secularisms that exist in the West, in particular in Europe, especially in Western Europe. Because obviously, no country in Western Europe approximates to the United States in terms of constitutional church-state separation. And actually no country in Western Europe or in Europe approximates to France. Of course, France is in Western Europe, but no other country in Western Europe approximates to France. So, as you will know from my work, I've tried to conceptualize a third form of political secularism, which better tracks historically and above all in terms of contemporary evolutions, better tracks the other countries in Northwestern Europe, like Britain, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, the Nordic countries. And I call that moderate secularism. And it shares some features with the United States, of course, the emphasis on religious freedom, but it also recognizes that there can be state-church partnerships, long-term historic partnerships for political goals, not for theological goals, but for what I call the public good. And I wonder what you think about the possibility of introducing a third concept or category of secularism in your typology, and then secondly, whether that might offer a better basis for thinking about the direction that you might wish Muslim majority countries to go, rather than just leaving it as passive secularism in general, as exemplified by the United States. Because it seems to me that most Muslim majority countries are a long, long way away from where United States is, or where they would want their country to be, where Muslims might want their country to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tarek. It's always great to see you. I hope we met in person. It's a very insightful question, and I really need to revise my paper just based on this question. Let me briefly mention a couple of points. First of all, I know your moderate secularism. I read many of your writings, maybe all of them, about this topic and listened, and I agree with you on 2 points. One, these American and French types based on very separationist models, constitutionally and otherwise. And we have statistical data from Jonathan Fox and others showing that the US seems to be exceptional in this wall of separation. And France and US are the only 2 cases where there is no religious instruction in public schools. In all other Western democracies, we have certain degrees. Hungary, if you still count the Western democracies, has a various form of teaching, but they have some form of religious instruction in public schools. Why am I really emphasizing this polar opposite? Really try to show the continuum. And in my book, I elaborate, but in the presentation, I didn't have time. But with late Alfred Stepan, and let me remember him, I miss him so much. He and I edited a volume on Turkey, Islam, Democracy, and Secularism in Turkey, where he and I wrote a chapter together saying that the ideal type and continuum of secularism. What I'm trying to emphasize, two polar opposite almost, Weberian ideal type. But I agree with you and Alfred Stepan, who used the concept of twin toleration rather than passive secularism. That is a matter of degree, it's a continuum, and countries are located generally between the two, and United Kingdom, although it has formal and established church, share with American passive secularism in terms of tolerating. And Netherlands, with its pillarization system, share with the notion of tolerating religion in public sphere. Whereas some other European countries recently passing headscarf ban or restrictive laws, minaret ban in Switzerland, etc. And I think it's a worrying trend to be influenced by the French laicity and more restrictive, combined with, of course, Islamophobia, combined with some genuine concern about terrorism certain Muslims perpetrated, unfortunately, since 9/11 and many cases in Europe. Therefore, theoretically, analytically, yes, these are Weberian ideal types, practically kind of exceptional, but they are informative, and the countries in between, they are more pragmatic. The German model and others incrementally change, adapted their local conditions, British, German, etc. But these two models, conceptually, they seem to be much more utopian notions. That's why both in the West and the Muslim world, people refer to them. And in the secularization debate, you really brought United Kingdom into the center of analysis, and Rajiv Bhargava brought India. But other than that, France and United States, since the 18th century, they really inspire many countries and really create some confusion. And I really try to eliminate confusion, clarify certain points. That's one thing. Second, regarding the Muslim world, again, I agree with you that the American level of separation may mean asking too much. But two things. One, there are already secular states in the Muslim world. Out of 50 countries, 20 are secular. 13 explicitly say this is a secular state, like Turkey, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Senegal, Mali, Niger. In this post-Soviet Central Asia, certain part of West Africa, certain part of East Europe, Turkey, and the Balkan nations. For them, there is a very strong political partisanship for secularism. They are not like the Arab world. They use the term secular in the constitution and public discourses. That's what I try to shape them and say that, no, it is not it shouldn't be assertive secularism, restrictive. Passive is better. But in countries like Pakistan and Southeast Asia countries, or in some Arab countries, though even in Arab countries, when my book was translated, Almania, that received some attention, even among Arab circles. The term secularism really is grappling. But for countries which are now Sharia, it would be too much utopian to move and shift to American type of separation. And the European experience, therefore, is enlightening that practically, even if you have Islam as official religion, you can still give citizenship rights, recognize, etc. And I agree with you. And let me conclude by this. For example, on the blasphemy case, now I'm also writing about the problems of blasphemy and apostasy laws. When I was asked to provide a recommendation, I say, okay, if completely abolishing them is too difficult, why don't you follow the European path? Keep them as dead letters in your code books for a while, but don't practice. And eventually, maybe that's what European did, that they eventually abolished, but they first made a dead letter. So I agree with you that as a practical solution, there are European democracies which still hold some official churches, but giving rights to religious minorities that may be a solution for some countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't want to take up too much time, but just one small point. I like a lot of your answer, and I can see that it's converging, that you and I are converging on that. But one theoretical difference between us is that I don't accept this idea of a continuum between assertive and passive secularism. I think there are multiple forms of secularism that have their own rationale. It's not a matter of dilution in strength or intensity in strength of the same concepts. And if I could put in a plug for our current research project called GREASE, G-R-E-A-S-E, which is an intercontinental, multi-continental project, including a number of Muslim majority countries as well as Europe. We try and show how there are different modes of political secularism at work. Of course, they're under contestation and they're changing, they have different dynamics, but they can't be reduced to a single continuum. So that's a theoretical difference. I think politically, pragmatically, and practically, we're a lot closer, but I just wanted to make that theoretical point. Thank you, Emmett.
Thank you so much for these clarifications. And I'm just looking around again, whether I see hands raised. Jocelyn, yeah, please. You have to unmute your microphone. Unmute your microphone, please.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on this discussion on secularism. What is striking, and Tarek, we had this discussion already together, is the focus only on the institutions. And so we get only half of the picture. The arrangement between state and religious organization is also grounded in a certain understanding of religion in society. So, and Ahmed, we already had this disagreement. If you think that Turkey is secular, if you look at Turkey at the societal level, yes, there's been a secularization and the change of status of religion in society. And I think, and you refer to Stepan a lot, and I agree, is also one of my major references. But what he looked into, and that you are not looking into, is the nation. The state doesn't operate floating over an uncharacteristic or undefined community. And that's also, Tarek, the problem I have. Political secularism is only one aspect. How much institution can change if they don't also interact with some major social trends? And that's a big difference between America and France. You can say, yes, they are both separating, although lots of lawyers and scholars would say that France is not separating as much when they want a grand mufti. But if you look at the status of society, the status of religion in society, it's completely different. So what, you know, so when people tell me, oh yes, America, there is God mentioned on the bill, yes, but how, the point is to bring all these elements, the societal, not social, societal and institutional together in order to really assess what, not secularism, but secularity, because secularism at the end of the day is an ideology. It is not a concept. So it's more like a remark for the discussion you are having, where and to bring the society back in this discussion and the feature of the political community in which this is happening, you know, that's.
Thank you, Joseph, if I can follow up. Thank you, Joseph.
Please.
This is important to understand Turkey because on the one hand, the constitution is secular, legal system is secular. But on the other hand, Tayyip Erdogan particularly made the public discourse very Islamist. Bureaucracy using an Islamist language and discourse. And definitely state-society interaction matters, and Jocelyn is right about that. And two more things very quickly, both Jocelyn and Tariq. One thing is that on the issue of whether state can impose secular ideology in the public sphere or not, there is a continuum. But on many other issues like financial aid and other aspects, I agree with Tariq that it's not a continuum, but different models. I'm just focusing on the ideological imposition as a comprehensive doctrine or not, but there are many other aspects, education, financial, etc., multiple models. Sometimes we even need to drop the term secularism, because for me, whether secular or not the state is, if there is the primary thing is the lawmaking. And in the Muslim world now, there is a trend of emphasizing Sharia law. The ulama is making the law in the courts, even as the Mufti office. And if they do, it is not participatory. It's not about contingent on changing conditions. We don't call it secular. That's why, for example, I strongly oppose to calling Ottoman Empire secular, because lawmaking was not secular whatsoever. Even if there is Kanunname of the sultans, ulama's Sharia were very influential too. It justified the Kanunname. And therefore, sometimes we can even drop the term secularism if even lawmaking is shaped by religion and religion is recognized officially, but there may still be some level of liberal values or toleration or coexistence. It is possible. And let me finally again remember Alfred Stepan and I, we use the term respect all, recognize all for Senegal, India, Indonesia, how, for example, they accept all religious holidays as holiday, how the state funds both pilgrimage to Vatican and Hajj to Mecca. It's a different system. It's becoming less possible to call secular, but still more inclusionary than a religious discrimination. Thank you.
Joseph, can I just go?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Because again, Ahmed, this is not going into the reality of the Diyanet was founded by Kemal Atatürk, not by Erdogan. The putting of all the clerics on the payroll of the state was done by Atatürk. That's this level not of institutionalization. If we look at the relation between state and religion as a sort of give and take by two different institutions, yes, but that's not what happened in the Muslim world at the end of the Ottoman Empire. And unlike what you are saying, I've done the study, except Indonesia, Senegal, and now Tunisia, most of the Muslim countries have absorbed Islamic institution, which is unprecedented. That is this level that cannot be called a secular institutionalization. It is the opposite. But at the level of society, yes, the practices have evolved. The interaction between people are not defined by religion and so on. I think we need to bring a little more flesh to the reality of society here. And I agree, we should drop secularism. There is no passive, we have different types of secularities. And that's a different approach, because then it goes into this interaction between different levels. And I didn't even bring the level of individual religiosity. So if you bring the three, but it's too complicated to do it in one setting. So that's my pushback on that.
Let me very briefly share a reflection. That's a very important point. In Tunisia and elsewhere, of course, there was a secularist discourse, but still bringing Islamic law in a reform way. In the Turkish case, they took Emil Komb's laïcité. First of all, if you really push hard, the United States is the only secular country in the world. France is not secular, because the French state finance all the church established before 1905. In Strasbourg and other Alsace-Lorraine region, the French state paid the salary of clergy.
I'm sorry, Ahmed, this is an anomaly.
Jocelyn, please listen.
There is lots of discussion on
you
that.
have to listen now. It's my time.
No,
So
no,
in France, out of,
Sorry.
Out of
sorry,
Ahmed has the word now. I have to act as chair.
In France, the government paid the salaries of teachers in Catholic schools, 25% of students attending them. Out of 11 holidays, 6 are Catholic holidays. 50% of public schools have Catholic chaplains. 1905, before established cathedrals fund maintenance of the state. Therefore, some call France Catholic, not laïque. That's one thing. You are not
undermining. You are making.
Let me finish, Jocelyn.
Yeah.
I can't talk like that.
Oh, you can.
Okay. Okay. Jocelyn, you are teaching Turkey to me. I am the Turkey expert. Okay.
You are teaching French to me.
I have a book on French laïcité. So.
No, I wrote a lot and I did surveys on Turkey too.
Okay, give me just in the Turkish case, Atatürk and his cadre took the Emil Combes model, because in France, 1904, there were 2 possible laïc models. One model promoted by the Prime Minister Emil Combes. He said, Catholic Church is like a snake. We have to keep it under control. We can't let it go. Separation is a bad idea. Then they push it in the parliament. Other forces in the French politics says, no, we want a separation. And they defeated Emil Combes and those who see Catholic Church as a dangerous snake. That resulted in 1905 separation model. In Turkey, they say Islam is too dangerous. We should keep Islam under control. That's why they built the Diyanet. I agree that it doesn't fit secularism. Today, I am promoting the idea that the Diyanet should be out of the government budget in order to make Turkey truly secular. But every country has its own way and exceptions. And that's a problematic exception of Turkish secularism, which is still secular. Otherwise, if we don't call Turkey secular, we shouldn't really use the term secular. Thank you.
Okay. I didn't say Turkey is not secular. The term is secularity. And that's not only Turkey. What happened to the Diyanet happened in Egypt, happened in Jordan, happened everywhere. So it's not only the French influence. And thank you for teaching me about Combes. I didn't know about that. Thank you.
So thank you so much to all of you. Yeah, I have at least learned so much from your debates and your controversy, and this is the best evidence. Yeah, that we need not much more research, that we need much more conferences, that we need much more debate to come together, despite of all these Corona lockdowns and the meetings we have only virtually. So I'm really looking forward to our ongoing research in this field. Thank you so much. And I would also like to thank the technical support and the technicians at EURAC Academy, that they stay so long with us, and they have enabled us to have almost 1 hour more in the debate. For this afternoon, and indeed this was a very long day, and we started with secularism and we ended with a huge clash, not of civilizations, but a clash of secularizations. So I find this very fascinating. Thank you again so much. And in this regard, I can only address you for the 2 panels tomorrow. We will start again at 9 o'clock tomorrow under the chair of Kerstin Monisch on the topic of gender and religion. And Henriette was very patient today and following us all day long in the panels. She will give a lecture tomorrow morning in the first panel. And then we have a closing panel on religion and education chaired by Wolfgang Beira, whom you can see now also on the screen. In this mood, good morning again to Ahmed in San Diego, and good night and good luck for all the people in Central Europe and in Western Europe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.